Across the endless expanse of ice and snow, the Arctic hides secrets long buried beneath frozen seas and shifting glaciers. Declassified Cold War files hint at patrols that vanished without a trace, convoys that lingered inexplicably in place, and listening posts that fell silent in regions where no human presence should endure. As you move through the faded pages and coded reports, the frozen landscapes of Ellesmere Island, Franz Josef Land, and the Beaufort Sea come alive with whispered anomalies and unexplained phenomena. Here, the patrols navigated treacherous ice flows, monitored enigmatic signals, and recorded observations that remain partially obscured by redactions. Step into the boots of those who first traced these mysteries, and feel the oppressive quiet, the biting wind, and the sense of something imperceptible moving just beyond sight, leaving questions that even decades of investigation have yet to answer. The Vanishing Ice Station Alpha. The drifting ice stations, established during the early Cold War, were designed to be ordinary by necessity. Floating laboratories where monotony was a form of safety and repetition was proof that nothing had gone wrong. Crews were trained to expect weeks of identical measurements, predictable radio schedules, and an environment so static it lulled even experienced polar specialists into routine. It is within this culture of deliberate normalcy that the disappearance of Ice Station Alpha emerges from the archives, not as a dramatic catastrophe, but as a quiet procedural failure that should not have been possible under the systems designed to prevent it. Ice Station Alpha was one of several Soviet drifting stations deployed across the Arctic Ocean in the early 1950s, part of a broader effort to map sea ice behaviour, collect meteorological data, and extend strategic awareness into regions that had become militarily significant almost overnight. These stations were established on thick, stable ice floes selected after aerial reconnaissance and ground verification, chosen precisely because they were expected to persist for months or even years. Alpha's assigned tasks were unremarkable on paper: atmospheric pressure readings, ice thickness measurements, ocean salinity samples, and scheduled radio transmissions at fixed intervals. Daily life on a drifting station followed a rigid structure that left little room for ambiguity. Logs were maintained meticulously, often noting temperature changes of a single degree, wind direction shifts measured in precise increments, and equipment maintenance down to the tightening of individual bolts. Radio operators followed strict transmission windows, sending updates that confirmed not only data collection, but the continued presence and functionality of the station itself. In the declassified records that survive, Ice Station Alpha's early logs reflect this discipline, presenting a portrait of stability rather than tension. The surviving documentation shows that Alpha's transmissions were received regularly during its initial operational period, with no indication of distress or equipment malfunction. Meteorological data matched expectations for the region and season, and ice drift calculations aligned with known Arctic current patterns. There were no references to unusual sounds, structural instability, or encounters with other vessels or stations. Even subtle anomalies which crews were trained to document carefully are absent from the early reports. The first signs of irregularity appear only when the records are read retrospectively, rather than as events unfolding in real time. A scheduled transmission window passed without contact, an occurrence that was not immediately alarming given the known challenges of high-latitude radio propagation. Atmospheric interference and auroral activity frequently disrupted signals, and short lapses were considered routine. The following transmission, however, was delayed without explanation, and while contact was eventually re-established, the accompanying log entry did not refer to the interruption. As days passed, the gaps became more difficult to dismiss. Transmission intervals grew inconsistent, and some datasets appeared truncated, ending abruptly where a full sequence would normally be expected. The tone of the logs did not change, remaining clinical and focused, but the absence of commentary on the disruption stood out to later analysts reviewing the files. In systems built around redundancy and reporting, silence itself becomes a form of deviation. The final confirmed communication from Ice Station Alpha is preserved only in summary form within declassified expedition files, its original transmission record either missing or never archived. It contained no alarm and no deviation from expected observational content, referencing routine measurements and ongoing drift. There was no indication that the crew anticipated difficulty, evacuation, or loss of the ice flow. After this point, Alpha ceased transmitting entirely. Standard response protocols dictated that attempts at re-establishing contact would continue for a defined period before escalating to search procedures. Records indicate that repeated radio calls were issued on Alpha's assigned frequencies, along with broader broadcast attempts intended to reach any listening stations or patrol aircraft in the region. None received a response. The absence of even intermittent signals suggested either a catastrophic equipment failure or a scenario in which the station was no longer capable of transmitting at all. Follow-up efforts were constrained by the Arctic environment itself. Aerial reconnaissance flights were limited by weather and fuel range, while the constant movement of ice floes meant that Alpha's last recorded position could not be treated as fixed. Later patrol reports described broad search areas rather than specific coordinates, with observers noting uninterrupted ice fields where a station might have drifted beyond visual range or fragmented into smaller sections indistinguishable from surrounding flows. What emerges next in the files is an unusual pattern in how Ice Station Alpha's documentation was handled after contact was lost. Unlike other drifting stations, whose operational records were consolidated into post-mission summaries, Alpha's files remained fragmented across multiple archival series, often misfiled under unrelated expeditions or technical annexes. Some meteorological datasets attributed to Alpha reappear later without attribution, while logistical records reference resupply plans that were never formally cancelled. This administrative disarray stands in contrast to the Soviet system's otherwise rigid record-keeping practices, suggesting that Alpha's disappearance created not only a physical absence on the ice, but a lingering uncertainty within the bureaucracy tasked with explaining it. What makes Ice Station Alpha particularly unsettling within the declassified files is not the loss of the station alone, but the absence of physical evidence confirming its fate. No debris, equipment fragments, or identifiable markings were documented in subsequent patrols. Other drifting stations lost during the Cold War typically left behind some trace, whether remnants embedded in ice or instruments recovered months later. Alpha left nothing that could be conclusively identified. In the years following its disappearance, references to Ice Station Alpha become increasingly oblique within official documentation. Planning reports for later drifting stations avoid mentioning it directly, instead referring vaguely to previous deployments when discussing risk mitigation and communication redundancy. Some archival folders contain summaries where Alpha's operational period is compressed into a single line, devoid of detail, suggesting a deliberate narrowing of the record rather than simple oversight. The declassification of Cold War Arctic expedition files has not resolved the fate of Ice Station Alpha, but it has clarified the boundaries of what is known and what is conspicuously missing. The station did not issue a distress call, did not report structural failure, and did not leave behind material evidence of destruction. Its disappearance exists as a gap in otherwise meticulous documentation, preserved not by dramatic testimony, but by the quiet persistence of unanswered procedural questions embedded in the icebound records. Somewhere within the drifting silence of the Arctic, Ice Station Alpha ended without explanation, leaving only a precise trail of data that stops exactly where certainty should have begun. The silent recon flight over Ellesmere Island. A hush settled over the Arctic skies as the reconnaissance aircraft lifted from Thule, carrying a crew whose mission was classified and whose presence went unrecorded in standard logs. The frozen expanse below stretched endlessly, jagged peaks and crevassed glaciers glowing under the pale light of a low winter sun. These northern reaches of Ellesmere Island had long been considered inhospitable, yet Cold War patrols occasionally ventured here, driven by suspicion, reconnaissance orders, and the imperative to monitor every shadow along the polar frontier. For the few who flew these missions, the skies were simultaneously familiar and alien, a place where maps could not fully account for the hidden terrain beneath the shifting ice. Radar plots from the Cold War era reveal intermittent blips that hinted at movements across Ellesmere Island, yet the official files remain frustratingly ambiguous. Analysts poring over the declassified documents noted patterns that did not correspond to known military exercises or civilian activity. These blips, sparse, fleeting, and sometimes doubling back on themselves, suggested that something, or someone, was deliberately avoiding detection. The files describe repeated adjustments to flight paths and altitudes, as navigators attempted to reconcile anomalies with the known geography of northern Ellesmere, a place where even minor miscalculations could leave an aircraft stranded in the Arctic wilderness. Instruments aboard the plane recorded sudden atmospheric anomalies that left navigators recalibrating their bearings with a mix of professional caution and unease. Temperature fluctuations, unexplained magnetic disturbances, and unexpected gusts of wind forced the crew to rely on both intuition and training. Pilots noted moments when the compass behaved erratically, swinging degrees in a manner inconsistent with polar magnetic drift. Engineers later speculated that these irregularities could have been caused by hidden electromagnetic devices or naturally occurring mineral deposits, yet no conclusive evidence has ever been found to explain the readings. Aerial photographs captured terrain that appeared altered, with faint traces of structures half buried under ice, challenging analysts to reconcile them with any known expeditions. Rectilinear shapes, shallow depressions, and aligned mounds were visible only from a bird's-eye view, and the official commentary in the files is cautious, noting only that these features require further examination. Photographs also hint at the presence of temporary equipment, possibly abandoned weather stations or supply caches, yet the scale and arrangement of these anomalies suggest planning beyond conventional Arctic patrol logistics. Scholars and historians who have studied the images remain divided, some suggesting natural formations, others proposing clandestine installations linked to Cold War intelligence operations. The flight crew reported peculiar sound distortions over the northern glaciers, fleeting and untraceable, that never appeared in any prior Arctic reconnaissance missions. Low-frequency hums, sudden echoes, and brief acoustic anomalies were recorded on onboard instruments, though they could not be reproduced in controlled simulations. Crew members later described the experience as disorienting, with sounds seeming to emanate from beneath the ice itself. These auditory phenomena were noted in the declassified logs, often accompanied by sketches and diagrams that attempted to map the shifting auditory landscape as the aircraft crossed unknown valleys and frozen plateaus. Declassified communications suggest that signals were intercepted and rerouted, leaving gaps in the flight's timeline that have since fueled speculation among historians. Radio exchanges show abrupt silences lasting several minutes, as well as coded messages whose meaning remains obscured. Some of these transmissions reference unidentified objects or movements observed from the aircraft, but subsequent summaries in the files redact or generalize the details. Analysts believe these gaps may indicate encounters with unrecorded installations or the deliberate masking of patrol routes for operational security. The deliberate ambiguity leaves a persistent question. What was the crew witnessing that required such extensive censorship? Thermographic scans revealed localized hotspots on the ice, incongruent with natural Arctic patterns, and prompting debates over whether they were technological anomalies or deliberate installations. Infrared imagery indicated areas of heat that did not correspond with sun exposure, geothermal activity, or other documented sources. Engineers suggested that the hotspots could be remnants of short-term equipment deployments, heating units for field experiments, or early-stage reconnaissance technology designed to remain invisible to ground observation. No definitive explanation exists, and the files themselves cautiously note these areas as unidentified thermal anomalies, a phrase that only deepens the enigma of Ellesmere's hidden landscapes. Observers noted the uncanny precision with which clouds and wind seemed to obscure parts of the flight path, as though nature itself conspired to hide what lay beneath. Sudden fog banks, shifting snow squalls, and temporary cloud cover created a patchwork of visibility that sometimes forced pilots to alter course at the last moment. Declassified meteorological logs hint that these weather patterns were unusually localized and persistent along specific trajectories, yet no official record explains their formation. Some historians suggest that these microclimates could have concealed sensitive installations, while others argue they may have been ordinary Arctic phenomena coinciding with the patrol's path in an improbable series of events. Satellite imagery from the period shows ghostly impressions of tracks leading toward the interior, but the details remain indecipherable, leaving only hints of human or mechanical activity. Tire marks, sled tracks, or temporary roadways appear faintly in overlapping photographs, yet none align with documented expeditions. Analysts who cross-referenced these images with declassified patrol logs found no correlation, deepening the sense of an unseen presence. Even today, the images retain their unsettling quality, a frozen landscape marked by the imprint of motion, but motion whose source remains unknowable. Crew diaries, partially redacted, recount fleeting glimpses of structures that defy conventional explanations, raising questions about the objectives of clandestine Cold War operations. Notes describe angular shapes, low-slung buildings, and objects that seem to shimmer against the ice under certain angles of sunlight. Sketches included in the diaries suggest that the crew attempted to catalogue every anomaly, though the language grows sparse and hesitant in later entries. These personal accounts, now declassified in part, reveal an underlying tension. The realization that the Arctic, remote as it is, held secrets that could challenge what the crew understood about both geography and geopolitics. After landing, the team's subsequent reports were heavily sanitized, with entire sections excised, suggesting that some truths about Ellesmere's northern reaches were never meant for public record. Logs, photographs, and annotated maps underwent multiple rounds of review, and only a limited portion eventually became available to researchers decades later. The files, while detailed in some respects, leave vast gaps that encourage speculation, rumour, and ongoing investigation. Analysts continue to debate the mission's true objectives, but the surviving evidence confirms only that the Arctic frontier contained more mysteries than the Cold War bureaucracy was willing to acknowledge. Newly released files also reveal that a secondary reconnaissance unit was dispatched shortly afterward, though its path and findings remain equally obscure. No corroborating reports exist, and the few remaining logs reference encrypted coordinates, radar anomalies, and intermittent communication with the first flight without providing resolution. This sequence of missions underscores the persistence of secrecy and the extent to which Arctic patrols were enmeshed in Cold War intelligence operations, leaving a shadowy record that continues to captivate those who study the period. An unmarked folder in the archive whispers of a flight whose secrets might still be waiting, frozen beneath the relentless Arctic expanse. The patrol that never returned from Franz Josef Land. Ice and shadow stretched endlessly across the northern horizon as the patrol set out from the temporary base, unaware that the landscape ahead would test every measure of their training and endurance. Franz Josef Land, remote and largely uninhabited, had long served as a strategic observation point during the Cold War, and patrols in the region were undertaken with a level of secrecy that left little trace in official documentation. The barren islands, framed by jagged glaciers and frozen straits, presented conditions that were as treacherous as they were isolating, where even minor errors could quickly escalate into life-threatening situations. The team carried sleds loaded with provisions, specialized instruments, and communication gear, each item carefully documented in declassified inventory logs meant to withstand the Arctic's unforgiving conditions. These logs detail rations capable of sustaining the patrol for weeks, emergency shelters designed for sub-zero survival, and surveying tools used to monitor ice movement and coastline shifts. Cold weather clothing, fur-lined boots, and oxygen supply apparatus were standard, reflecting both the environmental hazards and the clandestine nature of their operations. Each item was meticulously accounted for, yet the files foreshadow the absence of nearly everything after the patrol vanished. Glacial ridges rose sharply from the frozen sea, while shifting pack ice and hidden crevasses forced the patrol to navigate with a caution that even seasoned explorers described as relentless. Footfalls echoed against the ice, a rhythm soon swallowed by wind gusts that could reach hurricane force, often striking without warning. Patrol routes required constant adjustment, guided by topographic maps that, despite their precision, could not fully capture the treacherous undulations of the terrain. Snow bridges concealed yawning fissures, and sudden carving events sent tremors across the ice, reminding the patrol of the relentless unpredictability that defined Franz Josef Land. Sporadic radio transmissions recorded in Cold War files reveal abrupt silences and garbled messages, leaving analysts puzzled over what occurred during the patrol's journey. Logs note communications cut short mid-sentence, replies delayed or missing, and static that seemed to correspond with areas where ice density and atmospheric conditions were unusually high. The files show that supervisors monitored the patrol closely, yet even with modern reconstructions, no explanation resolves the enigmatic lapses. These silences have since fueled speculation that equipment, malfunction, environmental interference, or unknown human activity may have played a role. Witnessed from nearby observation posts, unusual ice formations and sudden snowdrifts suggested environmental dynamics that defied normal patterns and seemed to confound the patrol at every turn. Towers of ice sculpted by relentless wind appeared overnight, while snow dunes shifted as though directed by an invisible hand. Cold War-era meteorologists recorded temperature inversions and microclimates along the patrol route, phenomena that created pockets of dense fog and sudden whiteouts. In several instances, these natural formations altered the intended path of the team, leaving faint traces that would vanish within days. Supplies found months later, half buried in ice and snow, offered faint traces of human passage, hinting at the patrol's route without providing any definitive answers. Sled fragments, tattered rations, and personal items were recovered by subsequent expeditions, catalogued meticulously in Arctic recovery logs. Forensic analysis confirmed that these remnants had been exposed to extreme cold and wind abrasion, yet no evidence indicated the final whereabouts of the patrol itself. Each recovered object suggested hurried movement or abandonment, but the narrative they told remained incomplete, a fragmentary map of uncertainty. No rescue attempts involving icebreakers and reconnaissance flights encountered persistent fog, shifting ice, and treacherous currents, making the search perilous and inconclusive. Naval vessels documented cracks and unstable leads in the sea ice that prevented direct access to suspected locations, while aerial searches were hindered by Arctic storms that could appear without warning. Reports detail the extraordinary lengths undertaken by search teams, including sledging across glaciers and establishing temporary camps. Yet despite these efforts, no survivors were located, and no further trace of the patrol was recovered. Maps recovered from declassified archives show patrol paths intersecting with regions of unusual thermal activity and ice anomalies, raising questions that remain unanswered in official summaries. Coordinates annotated with cryptic symbols and temperature readings indicate areas where ice density and heat signatures fluctuated unexpectedly. Analysts have debated whether these anomalies resulted from natural geothermal activity, early experimental instrumentation, or clandestine operations unknown to the broader military apparatus. Regardless of the source, the maps underscore the complexity of the environment and the potential hazards that may have contributed to the disappearance. Equipment records indicate that some sleds and instruments were never recovered, while others showed signs of abrupt abandonment, a silent testimony to the patrol's sudden disappearance. Declassified reports highlight partially dismantled tools, missing navigation devices, and supplies left in circumstances suggesting urgent retreat or unforeseen interruption. The contrast between meticulous pre-expedition documentation and the chaotic state of recovered materials amplifies the mystery, raising questions about whether the patrol faced an environmental disaster, mechanical failure, or another factor that remains undocumented. Uncovered intelligence reports hint at Cold War objectives in the region, noting surveillance priorities and sensitive installations that may have influenced patrol decisions, though details are largely redacted. Observers at remote bases monitored the movement of Soviet and Allied forces, mapping shipping lanes, ice conditions, and radar coverage. While the files avoid explicit mention of any direct encounter, analysts have inferred that operational secrecy could have contributed to both the risk the patrol faced and the limited availability of public records regarding their disappearance. The pattern of Arctic patrol losses during this period suggests that environmental hazards, limited technology, and operational secrecy combined to create situations where teams could vanish without explanation. Records of similar missions in nearby regions reveal communication gaps, lost personnel, and unexplained equipment anomalies. Taken together, these patterns reinforce the notion that Franz Josef Land, despite its small size, represented a uniquely perilous environment where the margin for error was minimal, and even experienced patrols could be overwhelmed by the convergence of nature and geopolitics. Final notes in the archives place the patrol near a glacier tongue, where shifting ice and relentless wind would soon erase the faintest tracks, leaving only questions behind. Cartographers and Arctic historians have since attempted to reconcile these locations with environmental data, but shifting ice and sparse documentation prevent certainty. The last recorded coordinates, the fragments of sleds, and the silences in radio logs form a mosaic of disappearance that continues to intrigue researchers and Cold War historians alike. the frozen reaches of Franz Josef Land guard the patrol's fate in a silence so complete that even decades of investigation have been unable to awaken it. The unidentified tracks near Camp Century. Reports from Camp Century logs detailed the sudden appearance of tracks that puzzled both the station personnel and subsequent Arctic investigators. The tracks, first noticed during routine base inspections, seemed to have no immediate explanation. Camp Century, a top-secret US Cold War installation beneath Greenland's ice sheet, was designed for long-term scientific and military observation, and every movement around the base was carefully recorded. Yet these impressions appeared outside of any scheduled patrols or logistical operations, prompting concern and curiosity among both the stationed crews and the officers overseeing the Arctic program. Routine patrols and scientific operations at the base had been meticulously logged, providing a reference against which these mysterious impressions could be compared. Logs indicate daily movements for supply distribution, equipment checks, and exploratory surveys, all following consistent patterns across the ice sheet. Investigators immediately ruled out scheduled activity, noting that the tracks did not correspond with the documented paths of personnel, tracked vehicles, or supply sleds. The anomaly, though subtle, suggested that something or someone had traversed the area unnoticed, leaving behind an enigmatic trace in a controlled and heavily monitored environment. The tracks themselves were irregular in width and depth, suggesting weight and movement that did not correspond to standard sleds or known vehicles stationed at the camp. Some impressions were shallow, others deep enough to leave clear indentations in compacted ice, and the spacing between them varied in ways that made mechanical origin improbable. Specialists who examined the prints noted the absence of drag marks, a feature normally present when heavy equipment or sleds are manoeuvred over snow or ice. The inconsistencies hinted at an unusual source, one that did not align with any known patrol or logistical procedure at Camp Century. Arctic winds and sudden temperature shifts had altered the snow surface dramatically, complicating any attempt to determine the age or direction of the impressions. Meteorological data from the period show extreme fluctuations in temperature and sporadic gusts that could partially obscure tracks within hours, yet the patterns in question remained unusually distinct. Analysts studied the logs alongside recorded wind speeds and snowdrift patterns, concluding that environmental effects alone could not account for the precise and uninterrupted formation of the impressions. Each investigation only deepened the sense of mystery surrounding the track's origin. Observers carefully photographed and sketched the tracks, creating a detailed visual record that would later appear in partially declassified files. Images reveal a trail that meanders in unexpected directions, at times curving sharply and then continuing straight for extended stretches. Measurements were recorded with painstaking accuracy, capturing depth, width, and the distance between impressions. The visual documentation allowed analysts decades later to study the anomaly remotely, yet no clear explanation emerged, leaving the trail as one of the most perplexing pieces of evidence in the history of Camp Century. When compared with known patrol routes, the patterns of the tracks revealed abrupt turns and spacing inconsistent with conventional travel over snow and ice. Regular patrols followed predictable circuits to supply points, monitoring stations, and observation posts, but these tracks veered away from those established paths. In some cases, the impressions moved into areas considered too dangerous or inaccessible for routine activity, including stretches over thin ice and near concealed crevasses. This divergence reinforced the impression that the origin of the trail was not related to normal operations and may have involved an entirely unknown entity or event. Released materials reference unusual readings from nearby sensors, though the reports remain cautious, avoiding any definitive explanation for the anomaly. Thermographic devices occasionally registered unexplained heat signatures near sections of the trail, while seismic sensors recorded faint vibrations inconsistent with standard patrol activity. Analysts reviewing the files noted that all recordings were sporadic, often lasting only a few seconds, and the reports provide no conclusive interpretation. These anomalies were officially categorized as unverified observations, leaving their significance unresolved but compelling in the context of Cold War-era or Arctic operations. Subsequent patrols attempted to follow the trail, only to encounter rapidly drifting snow, shifting ice, and conditions that erased further evidence within hours. teams documented their attempts to trace the path, marking locations where the impressions vanished beneath fresh accumulation or where windswept ridges obscured the route entirely. Even under controlled observation, recreating the conditions proved nearly impossible, suggesting that the environment itself played a role in concealing the full extent of whatever had left the tracks. These repeated failures heightened the sense of unease among base personnel. Certain sections of the track suggested a presence moving counter to prevailing wind patterns, leaving investigators to question whether natural forces or unknown activity had shaped them. Snow displacement analysis indicated movement in directions opposite to the expected drift caused by high winds, further complicating interpretation. While natural ice deformation and wind erosion were considered, the patterns were too deliberate and consistent to be fully explained by environmental factors alone. The track's irregularity and directionality remain one of the most compelling aspects of their mystery. Official explanations noted in archival reports cite ice deformation, strong gusts, or human oversight, yet none of these fully accounts for the peculiar characteristics observed. Analysts cautiously propose that the impressions might be remnants of an early mechanical experiment or unauthorized field excursion, but no record substantiates such possibilities. The juxtaposition of highly controlled operations at Camp Century with these unaccounted for traces underscores the tension between known activity and unexplained anomalies in Arctic patrol history. The discovery influenced base operations, prompting adjustments to patrol schedules, monitoring procedures, and safety protocols, while leaving personnel unsettled by the unexplained phenomenon. Officers ordered more frequent surface checks and enhanced logging of patrol routes, and declassified communications indicate that personnel were briefed on remaining vigilant for further anomalies. The presence of the track sparked both operational concern and enduring curiosity, marking the incident as one of the few unexplained events that penetrated even the strict secrecy of Camp Century. In the final recorded observations, the trail disappeared into a crevasse-strewn ridge, leaving only a faint impression that would gradually vanish beneath fresh snowfall. Despite repeated study and documentation, no subsequent patrol could locate additional evidence or identify a source. The records, photographs, and sketches remain as silent witnesses to a phenomenon that defies conventional explanation, preserved only in the partially declassified archives that later researchers would consult with both fascination and frustration. Beneath the layers of ice and secrecy, the tracks near Camp Century linger as a frozen puzzle, hinting at events that no record has yet been able to resolve. The submarine signals beneath the Beaufort Sea. During a routine Cold War patrol, sonar operators recorded signals beneath the Beaufort Sea that defied identification, prompting immediate attention from Naval Command. The readings appeared sporadically, sometimes lasting only a few seconds, yet their irregular pattern and depth marked them as distinctly anomalous. The patrol, part of a series of Cold War surveillance operations, was tasked with monitoring both Soviet and Allied submarine activity, using advanced sonar arrays to detect even subtle acoustic signatures. The initial reports were classified and circulated only among senior officers, reflecting the high stakes of Arctic undersea operations during this tense period. Submarine patrols in the region followed strict operational protocols, maintaining depth, course, and communication schedules designed to minimize detection while monitoring strategic waterways. Logs reveal meticulously planned routes across ice-choked channels and under thick sea ice, where crews relied on both acoustic and navigational instruments to avoid obstacles and maintain stealth. Every maneuver was documented, from course corrections to depth adjustments, providing a baseline against which anomalies such as the unidentified signals could later be compared. The initial acoustic anomalies registered intermittently on sonar screens, displaying frequencies and patterns unlike any known Allied or enemy vessels documented in declassified logs. Operators noted unusual pulse intervals, irregular spacing, and a movement that did not match the speed or direction of standard submarine propulsion. Analysts later reviewing the logs described the signals as highly atypical, a designation that implied both technical uncertainty and operational intrigue. Even minor deviations in sonar readings were taken seriously, given the potential implications for Arctic strategic intelligence. Undersea conditions in the Beaufort Sea, including thermoclines, salinity gradients, and ice cover, influenced sound propagation in ways that complicated the interpretation of the signals. Cold, dense water layers could bend acoustic waves, creating echoes or apparent shifts in location, while thick ice overhead reflected sound differently than open water. Patrol officers meticulously recorded environmental data alongside acoustic readings, but the anomalies persisted despite accounting for these variables. The complex interplay of water properties, ice, and depth made definitive conclusions difficult, leaving the true source of the signals an open question. The limitations of Cold War sonar technology became immediately apparent as operators struggled to distinguish between natural undersea echoes and potential submarine movement. Early sonar systems were particularly sensitive to Arctic-specific conditions, with ice cover reflecting sound unpredictably and sharp thermoclines bending acoustic waves in ways that could create phantom readings. Underwater ridges and uneven seafloor topography further complicated interpretation, producing echoes that mimicked movement or created apparent shifts in position. Operators relied heavily on manual analysis, as automated filtering and signal recognition was still rudimentary, leaving even experienced crews uncertain about whether they were tracking an actual vessel or encountering an environmental anomaly. These technological constraints heightened both the difficulty of the investigation and the sense of mystery surrounding the unexplained signals. Patrol officers attempted to triangulate the source using available equipment, deploying depth changes and signal repetition tests to verify their readings. Procedures involved altering the submarine's position and observing changes in signal strength, while cross-referencing data from multiple sonar arrays. Yet despite these careful maneuvers, the signals behaved unpredictably, sometimes vanishing entirely or shifting in ways that could not be reconciled with known vessel movement. Each attempt at verification deepened the sense of an unresolved mystery in the depths. Over subsequent days, repeated detections revealed erratic patterns, with signals appearing, disappearing, and sometimes shifting location without explanation. Logs indicate moments when sonar operators debated whether the readings were equipment errors, environmental phenomena, or the presence of an unknown craft. The persistence of the anomalies suggested an actual object or event, yet one that defied conventional understanding of undersea activity. For crews, the inconsistency was as unnerving as the signals themselves, producing both fascination and concern. Declassified files refer to the signals as unidentified acoustic events, with officers internally speculating about their origin while maintaining official discretion. Notes in the archives hint at theories ranging from foreign submarines operating covertly beneath the ice to experimental underwater technology, although none have been confirmed. The cautious phrasing in reports underscores both the secrecy and uncertainty surrounding the detections. Even today, these files represent one of the few windows into Cold War-era Arctic submarine anomalies. Analysts compared the anomalies with the movements of documented submarines, yet no known vessel corresponded to the time, location, or acoustic signature of the readings. Patrol schedules were cross-referenced with the signals, revealing no overlap with Allied or Soviet operations, and no routine naval exercises could account for the irregular pulse patterns. The absence of any matching vessel reinforced the idea that the Beaufort Sea readings represented an unusual or unprecedented occurrence, one that remained unresolved in official documentation. Some characteristics of the signals, including sudden acceleration and irregular pulse intervals, challenged conventional understanding of submarine technology and sonar behavior. Acoustic specialists later noted that no known propulsion system at the time could produce the combination of frequency and movement recorded. The apparent ability of the source to appear and vanish rapidly, as well as to shift unpredictably, suggested either an unknown technological capability or an environmental phenomenon beyond standard explanation. The presence of the signals influenced patrol strategy, prompting adjustments to routes, depth, and monitoring schedules, while heightening vigilance among crews. Officers ordered additional sonar sweeps, staggered patrols, and heightened reporting protocols, reflecting the seriousness of the anomaly. Even routine operations were conducted with the awareness that the unexplained signals could appear at any time, a factor that injected tension into otherwise carefully controlled missions. Historical patterns of acoustic anomalies in Arctic waters suggested a mix of environmental and human-made possibilities, though none fully accounted for the Beaufort Sea readings. Previous Arctic sonar reports had recorded strange echoes and anomalous readings, often attributed to ice movement, thermoclines, or equipment sensitivity. Yet the Beaufort Sea signals differed in duration, intensity and repetition, prompting some analysts to describe them as singular in Cold War naval records. The combination of rarity, consistency and inaccessibility of the environment left the mystery unresolved. The final recorded detection, logged with precise coordinates and timestamps, vanished as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving no tangible evidence beyond sonar archives. Despite repeated analysis, the source was never confirmed, and no follow-up expedition could replicate or locate it. The files remain a testament to both the limits of contemporary technology and the hidden complexities of Arctic undersea operations, preserving the enigma for future generations of researchers. The unexplained signals in the Beaufort Sea linger in the naval archives, a hidden trace of activity that no investigation has yet been able to clarify. The unidentified frozen camp recorded during Operation Nanook. Patrol logs from Operation Nanook first referenced an unrecognizable cluster of structures partially buried in ice, an anomaly that drew immediate scrutiny from commanding officers. The camp, located along a remote stretch of Arctic coastline, had not appeared on prior maps or satellite images, making its presence all the more puzzling. Officers on site documented its coordinates, noting that even under partial snow cover, the foundations and outlines of the structures were unmistakable. The sudden emergence of such a site during a carefully monitored patrol challenged assumptions about activity in the region, particularly given the tightly controlled nature of Cold War Arctic operations. Operation Nanook, designed to map and monitor Arctic conditions while maintaining a strategic presence, relied on highly coordinated patrols and reconnaissance flights across Greenland and surrounding waters. Logs detail the systematic surveying of ice conditions, ocean currents and land formations, as well as the tracking of any foreign or unknown vessels that might be operating in the area. Each patrol was carefully scheduled with designated checkpoints and reporting requirements to ensure both safety and strategic awareness. Against this backdrop of methodical observation, the frozen camp stood out as an unexplained irregularity, prompting officers to prioritize documentation and further analysis. Initial observations revealed rectangular foundations and fragmented shelters, arranged in patterns unlike those used in documented military or scientific stations, raising questions about their origin. Some structures appeared hastily constructed, while others seemed more permanent, suggesting multiple phases of occupation. Equipment remnants were scattered around the site, yet none matched the inventory lists from known installations, leaving analysts to wonder whether the camp had been built by a temporary expedition, an unrecorded patrol, or a previously unknown operation entirely. Extreme temperatures, shifting snowdrifts, and hidden crevasses made close inspection perilous, forcing teams to rely on remote photography and cautious mapping from secure positions. Officers noted that approaching too closely could endanger personnel, as thin ice and concealed crevasses threatened both mobility and safety. Even from a distance, patrol members observed subtle signs of human activity: compacted snow where tents once stood, faint impressions of pathways, and scattered equipment partially encased in ice. These details were meticulously recorded, emphasizing both the caution and curiosity that defined Arctic reconnaissance missions. Patrols employed cameras, sketching tools, and observational logs to create the most accurate record possible under the challenging conditions, emphasizing measurement precision and consistent documentation. Photographs captured the layout from multiple angles, while sketches annotated dimensions, orientation, and any unusual features. Officers cross-referenced their notes with maps and prior patrol data to ensure accuracy, and reports were filed with commanding officers for further review. Even these detailed records, however, could not resolve the underlying mystery of who had constructed the camp and why it had remained undetected until Operation Nanook. Several features of the camp defied standard classification, including irregular storage units and unanticipated placement of tents and equipment, suggesting either temporary occupation or unusual operational protocols. Observers noted that some items appeared designed for rapid assembly and disassembly, while others resembled makeshift laboratories or observation points. The juxtaposition of hurried construction with more permanent installations created a contradictory impression. The site was at once transient and deliberate, practical yet enigmatic. This duality added to the uncertainty surrounding its purpose and origin. Analysts compared the site to known Cold War installations, but discrepancies in size, layout, and construction material prevented definitive alignment with documented bases. Materials used in some structures were unfamiliar or sourced in ways that did not correspond with military supply chains, and the orientation of certain tents and shelters suggested a design philosophy inconsistent with established Arctic expeditions. Despite careful cross-referencing, no prior records or reconnaissance imagery indicated the existence of such a site, making it one of the few truly unexplained installations encountered during Operation Nanook. Declassified files note internal discussions regarding the camp, highlighting both curiosity and caution among officers while acknowledging the uncertainty surrounding its purpose. Some entries speculated that it could have been a covert research site, a temporary outpost, or even an abandoned project from an earlier patrol, yet no conclusive evidence supported any of these theories. Language in the files was deliberately neutral, reflecting the need to document observations without assigning speculative or unverified explanations, a hallmark of Cold War-era reporting. Subsequent patrols attempted to revisit the site, yet snow accumulation and ice movement often obscured key features, making longitudinal study difficult and inconclusive. Logs describe attempts to measure changes in structure exposure, pathways, and surrounding terrain, but natural shifts in the environment repeatedly erased prior evidence. Even repeated flyovers captured only partial views as the camp gradually disappeared beneath fresh snow and ice drifts, leaving gaps in documentation that compounded the uncertainty. Experts reviewing the records struggled to reconcile environmental evidence, architectural anomalies, and operational context, leaving the camp's function and origin open to speculation. The combined challenges of harsh Arctic conditions, partial documentation, and the camp's ambiguous design meant that analysts could only outline possibilities rather than draw definitive conclusions. Some hypothesized a temporary scientific outpost while others considered clandestine military activity, yet all agreed that the frozen camp defied clear categorization. The discovery prompted adjustments in patrol routes and observation priorities, with officers emphasizing enhanced photographic coverage and careful notation of any further anomalies. Patrol strategies were modified to allow closer observation of potential sites, while additional sensors and photographic equipment were deployed to capture more accurate readings. These measures underscore the seriousness with which Arctic reconnaissance treated unexplained findings, recognizing that even minor anomalies could carry strategic significance in the context of Cold War operations. The final documented encounter captured the camp as a partially buried frozen cluster of structures, its details gradually fading under relentless Arctic conditions, leaving its history uncertain. By the time later patrols returned, windblown snow and ice accumulation had altered the landscape, erasing many of the distinct markers noted in initial reports. What remained were fragments, foundations, partial shelters, and traces of human activity that hinted at an unknown purpose, leaving the camp an enduring question within the official records of Operation Nanook. Archived accounts from Operation Nanook preserve the frozen camp as a silent testament to human presence lost to time and ice, its true purpose remaining an unsolved Arctic enigma. The patrol logs that were partially redacted forever. Scrutiny of Cold War-era Arctic records revealed extensive blacked-out sections, hinting at operations that were deliberately hidden from all but a select few. From the moment analysts first examined these files, it became clear that vast portions of each document were intentionally obscured, leaving only fragments of routine entries visible. The contrast between ordinary navigational notes and the dense redactions created a palpable tension, suggesting that the hidden content concerned matters far beyond routine patrols. Even small glimpses of censored information ignited questions about what had transpired in these remote regions and why it was deemed so sensitive. These missions, often conducted under extreme conditions, combined scientific observation with surveillance, mapping routes, ice conditions, and foreign naval presence across Arctic waters. Patrols moved deliberately across frozen seas and along jagged coastlines, recording weather patterns, ice thickness, and ocean currents while maintaining vigilance for unknown or hostile activity. The precision of these operations, outlined in the unredacted segments of the logs, underscores the high level of planning required for Cold War Arctic expeditions, where survival, intelligence, and secrecy were tightly intertwined. The first striking redactions appeared amid otherwise routine entries, obscuring coordinates, equipment usage, and occasional references to unidentified contacts. Officers' notes were blacked out entirely in places where sonar readings, aerial reconnaissance data, or unusual observations were recorded, suggesting that the content was either classified or too sensitive for later review. The sudden absence of information stood in stark contrast to the surrounding detail, amplifying the mystery and leaving modern researchers to speculate about what had been erased. In contrast, unredacted passages meticulously detailed mundane tasks, ice sampling, weather observations, and standard navigation checks, emphasizing the jarring interruption where information was withheld. Entries about equipment maintenance, meal rotations, and daily patrol routines proceeded in painstaking order, yet any mention of potentially significant discoveries or unusual encounters was systematically removed. This juxtaposition made the redactions all the more conspicuous, drawing attention precisely to the areas deemed too sensitive to reveal. Analysts noted clusters of redactions around particular dates and locations, suggesting a deliberate pattern possibly linked to sensitive strategic operations or unexplained phenomena. Certain sectors of the Arctic, particularly regions near contested ice channels, remote islands, or under-monitored fjords, were repeatedly redacted, hinting that specific activities or observations had been recorded there. The pattern implied both operational secrecy and the possibility of unusual events that patrols had encountered but were forbidden to fully document. Technical descriptions of sonar sweeps, radio transmissions, and aerial observations were frequently interrupted by blacked-out sections, leaving operators' observations incomplete. In some instances, entire paragraphs describing the direction of signals, signal strength, or potential contacts were removed, effectively erasing any trace of what had been detected. The gaps suggest that sensitive technology, unidentified vessels, or anomalous phenomena might have been involved, though the records themselves provide no definitive answers. Redaction procedures themselves were highly methodical, often reflecting strict protocols designed to prevent even inadvertent disclosure of sensitive information. Officers followed detailed guidelines that dictated which sections could be blacked out, how coded terminology should be handled, and what supporting evidence might remain visible in margins or annotations. Occasionally, cryptic symbols or abbreviations persisted in the unredacted text, hinting at the underlying subject matter without revealing specifics. These measures ensured that sensitive operations, unusual encounters, or classified technology remained hidden, yet they also left the logs appearing fragmented and incomplete, adding a layer of mystery for anyone attempting to interpret the records. Marginal notes and annotations occasionally survived, revealing officer instructions about confidentiality, heightened attention to security, and the handling of classified findings. Small handwritten remarks noted the importance of not sharing certain information beyond the immediate command, emphasizing the need for strict operational secrecy. These surviving notes hint at the human effort to maintain security protocols, even in the face of potentially extraordinary events. Knowledge of sensitive content appeared to influence patrol strategy, as logs indicate route adjustments, extended observation periods, and heightened reporting whenever certain sectors were approached. Officers made repeated notes of increased vigilance and additional monitoring, suggesting that even without access to the redacted details, the potential significance of these areas was recognized. Patrol decisions were informed not just by ice conditions or standard operational objectives, but by the unseen data concealed within the censored sections of the logs. Historical cross-referencing with other Arctic mission files showed only partial alignment, confirming that key details remain permanently inaccessible due to the redactions. Satellite imagery, other patrol reports, and archived correspondence provided context, but failed to clarify the content of the blacked-out entries. The log stood as a record of both action and omission, offering a rare window into Arctic operations while simultaneously keeping essential aspects hidden from scrutiny. Contextual interpretation based on available entries suggests that some events were extraordinary, yet their true nature remains obscured, a testament to the tension between recorded fact and enforced secrecy. Analysts can infer that unusual sonar signals, unanticipated encounters, or sensitive intelligence tasks may have been documented, but without the full text, any conclusions remain speculative. The juxtaposition of meticulous observation with permanent erasure amplifies the sense of mystery surrounding these Arctic patrols. researchers studying the logs today confront gaps too vast to reconstruct, leaving questions about operational priorities, mysterious observations, and the ultimate scope of the missions unanswered. Academic and military historians alike acknowledge the frustration of encountering records that are simultaneously detailed and incomplete, providing compelling clues while withholding definitive explanations. These limitations are compounded by the extreme remoteness of the patrol areas, where corroborating evidence is rarely available. The enduring redactions serve as a stark reminder that certain Cold War Arctic patrol activities were deliberately erased from the public record, creating a permanent void in understanding. The redacted logs encapsulate the tension between documentation and concealment, revealing a disciplined attempt to maintain secrecy, even as they leave tantalizing hints of events and observations that may have altered our understanding of Arctic operations. The partially redacted logs preserve a shadow of events that may never be fully known, leaving the Arctic Patrol's most guarded secrets suspended in silence. The icebreaker that logged a coastline that shouldn't exist. The icebreaker's instruments first registered a solid landmass where charts had indicated only open sea and shifting ice. As the vessel advanced along the Arctic expanse, officers noted readings on sonar and radar that suggested the presence of a coastline absent from existing maps. The discovery was immediately logged, the coordinates meticulously recorded, yet the crew remained cautious, aware that Arctic conditions could produce optical illusions or distortions in navigational instruments. Despite these concerns, repeated measurements indicated that the anomaly persisted, a feature that, according to all official documentation, simply should not exist. Its mission combined the routine mapping of Arctic waters with strategic observation, ensuring both navigational accuracy and Cold War-era intelligence collection. The icebreaker had been deployed not only to chart ice flows and verify sea routes, but also to monitor for any foreign or unreported activity, a task made all the more crucial in an era of heightened geopolitical tension. Crews were trained to observe, record, and report with precision, their logs forming the foundation for operational planning and scientific understanding alike. Within this context, the unexpected coastline immediately drew heightened attention. Crew members noted the unusual contour of the shoreline in their logs, marking coordinates with a mixture of precision and incredulity. Officers described jagged outcroppings, irregular beaches, and inlets that appeared both real and impossible, contrasting starkly with satellite imagery and prior reconnaissance reports. Sketches and notes recorded in the margins emphasized the anomaly's distinct features, yet none could account for its sudden appearance or lack of precedent in historical charts. The tension between observation and expectation became a focal point of the mission. Snow squalls and drifting ice made visual confirmation challenging, yet the outline persisted through multiple observation attempts, hinting at a tangible reality. Visibility shifted constantly, and shifting ice often obscured portions of the supposed shoreline, forcing officers to rely on both direct observation and instrument readings. Even when the coast appeared intermittently between weather breaks, it maintained a consistency that defied the surrounding environment, challenging assumptions about ice formations and the reliability of long-established maps. Radar sweeps and sonar scans repeatedly returned signals consistent with a firm coastline, contradicting every pre-existing map and satellite record. The icebreaker's advanced equipment detected variations in depth and reflectivity that aligned with solid land rather than temporary ice ridges or drifting pack ice. Officers meticulously recorded these readings, noting that instruments calibrated against known benchmarks confirmed the anomaly as a persistent and measurable feature, yet one whose existence conflicted with all known data. Extra precautions were taken by the crew to calibrate each instrument against known landmarks and ice formations, ensuring that the anomalous readings were not the result of technical error. Sonar and radar systems were repeatedly tested using previously mapped islands, icebergs, and coastal markers, while optical observations were cross-checked during breaks in snow squalls and fog. Officers accounted for environmental factors such as magnetic variation, solar glare, and shifting ice, meticulously recording adjustments to maintain accuracy. Despite these careful verifications, the anomaly consistently appeared in the same coordinates, reinforcing its persistence and deepening the mystery surrounding the unexpected coastline. Previous navigational charts were consulted immediately, revealing no precedent for a landmass in that location and deepening the sense of dissonance among officers. Maps from prior expeditions, including both publicly available and classified charts, showed only open water and ice flows, where the icebreaker's instruments indicated solid terrain. This discrepancy prompted discussion among officers and analysts, who debated whether the anomaly was an error, a previously unmapped island, or evidence of an unknown natural or man-made feature. Preserved log entries describe both fascination and unease, as officers debated whether the anomaly was natural, technological, or otherwise inexplicable. The logs, preserved in Cold War archives, capture the uncertainty and the meticulous attention to detail, reflecting the crew's struggle to reconcile empirical data with the impossible. Language in these entries is precise, yet tinged with caution, acknowledging the anomaly without venturing into speculation that could compromise operational credibility. Potential explanations ranged from unusual ice formations and geomorphological phenomena to previously undisclosed military activity, though no single theory could be confirmed. Some officers suggested that tidal ice ridges or unique glacial processes might produce the illusion of solid land, while others speculated that the coastline could be linked to secret Cold War operations, including temporary installations or covert surveys. Despite these theories, all remained speculative, and the logs ultimately recorded observations rather than conclusions. Follow-up reconnaissance over subsequent days attempted to trace the coastline's full extent, yet conditions often concealed or distorted the apparent landmass. Thick fog, drifting snow, and shifting ice continually altered visibility, forcing the crew to rely on repeated instrument scans and cautious navigation. While some sections were mapped consistently, others appeared and disappeared with environmental changes, creating an impression of a mutable or semi-illusory landscape that defied conventional cartography. Patrol decisions were affected, with routes adjusted to verify and document the anomaly, illustrating the operational weight of what might have been a cartographic impossibility. Officers extended patrols, altered observation angles, and maintained continuous records, emphasizing the importance of accuracy despite uncertainty. Logs indicate that multiple sweeps were conducted at varying speeds and distances to ensure that readings were not artifacts of instrumentation or observer error, reinforcing the seriousness with which the crew treated the anomaly. Crew reflections recorded in private notes convey the disorientation and wonder provoked by encountering an apparent coastline that challenged all prior knowledge. Personal journals mention conversations about the limits of perception, the unpredictability of the Arctic environment, and the possibility that the anomaly might never be fully understood. These reflections reveal not just procedural diligence, but a human response to encountering the unexpected in one of the most extreme and controlled settings of Cold War operations. The final mapping attempt left officers with detailed charts, photographs, and logs, yet the mystery of the coastline remained unresolved, suspended between observation and impossibility. Data collected during the expedition provided a record of the coordinates, contours, and measured depths, but without corroboration or precedent, the anomaly persisted as an enigmatic entry in Cold War Arctic archives. The icebreaker had recorded what instruments consistently suggested was real, yet no existing map could account for it, leaving the feature a permanent question mark in the official record. The coastline logged by the icebreaker persists in historical records as a silent enigma, defying maps and memory alike. The Lost Weather Detachment of Severnaya Zemlya. The detachment arrived on Severnaya Zemlya under a sky heavy with low Arctic clouds, their mission clearly defined yet shadowed by the isolation of the remote archipelago. Small transport planes had delivered personnel, supplies, and scientific instruments to the designated site, leaving the team to establish tents, weather stations, and observation posts. Though the operation was routine by Cold War standards, the sheer remoteness of the location lent a sense of vulnerability, as the surrounding glaciers and fjords offered both shelter and concealment from external oversight. The detachment's presence was catalogued in central logs, but already the Arctic silence seemed to press in around them. Their primary task was to monitor meteorological patterns critical for both navigation and strategic operations, with each reading carefully transmitted to Central Command. The data was vital for predicting ice flows, planning naval patrols, and providing early warning for aircraft movements across the polar corridor. Instruments measured temperature, barometric pressure, wind velocity and cloud formations with painstaking precision, and each observation was cross-checked against satellite reports when available. The detachment's work represented both scientific diligence and military necessity, a dual role that demanded constant attention in a setting where error could prove fatal. Days were structured around constant instrument checks, ice measurements, and meticulous recording of temperatures, wind speeds, and atmospheric pressure. Each officer and technician had assigned responsibilities from maintaining anemometers to calibrating thermographs, ensuring continuity in the face of unpredictable conditions. Journals noted that even minor deviations in readings were documented, reflecting both operational discipline and the understanding that the Arctic could obscure even the simplest truth. Despite routine, a subtle tension threaded through the team, awareness of how quickly the environment could shift from calm to deadly. Blizzards and shifting ice required vigilance, forcing the team to constantly adapt tents, instruments, and supply lines to the unforgiving environment. Snowdrifts could bury meteorological stations in hours, while sudden ice breaks threatened the stability of observation points along the coast. The officers frequently climbed ridges to survey terrain, while others reinforced shelters with additional anchors and snow walls. Equipment was regularly inspected for frost damage, and supply caches were reorganized to prevent exposure to the elements. The Arctic was unforgiving, and the detachment knew that even a minor lapse could carry severe consequences. A subtle irregularity first emerged in the data transmissions, a brief lapse followed by readings that defied expected patterns, raising cautious concern among officers. Temperature spikes, unusual wind shifts, and unexplained atmospheric anomalies were recorded in quick succession, yet no immediate explanation presented itself. The detachment's logs reflected a mixture of scientific curiosity and practical caution, noting that equipment functioned normally while the environmental readings continued to puzzle the team. While such fluctuations were not unprecedented in the high Arctic, the timing and combination of anomalies sparked quiet unease. Repeated attempts to communicate from Central Command met with static, garbled signals and occasionally incomplete reports that hinted at operational difficulties. Operators monitoring the detachment's transmissions noted interruptions and inconsistencies, yet could not determine whether these were caused by atmospheric interference, technical failure, or a more pressing concern. Each failed attempt to establish a clear connection compounded the sense of isolation, leaving both officers on site and command personnel in Moscow to speculate on what might be occurring in the frozen expanse. Surviving log entries capture moments of unease and meticulous observation, noting strange ice formations, unexpected weather shifts, and unexplained equipment anomalies. Officers documented how ridges appeared to move, how crevasses seemed deeper than predicted, and how auroral activity occasionally interfered with communication signals. The language of the logs is precise yet reflective, suggesting that even as the team fulfilled their scientific obligations, a growing sense of unpredictability undercut their confidence. These records, now part of declassified files, preserve the tension of a mission conducted at the intersection of human endurance and environmental unpredictability. Arctic patrols were dispatched, navigating treacherous seas and shifting ice to locate the team, yet search reports emphasized the sheer difficulty of operating in such a harsh, isolated environment. Icebreaker support and reconnaissance aircraft were deployed to trace the detachment's last known coordinates, mapping ice flows and potential landing zones. Despite advanced technology and careful planning, the combination of severe weather, drifting ice, and limited visibility constrained search operations. Observers recorded the landscape as a maze of frozen channels, cliffs, and hidden inlets, each complicating efforts to reach the detachment and verify its status. Comparable incidents from other Arctic detachments were cited in internal analyses, highlighting patterns of delayed communications, disappearance, and the hazards of remote operations. Analysts noted that teams stationed in high-latitude locations often face logistical isolation, rapidly changing weather, and the constant threat of equipment failure. Historical comparisons underscored how even well-prepared units could vanish without a trace, leaving minimal evidence for investigators and creating enduring questions in military and scientific records. Declassified notes and annotations reveal cautious speculation, redacted sections hinting at possible anomalies or operational risks without confirming any cause. Officers reviewing communications and logs pondered equipment malfunctions, ice collapses, or unforeseen environmental phenomena, yet all conclusions were tentative. The redacted sections convey a sense of deliberate discretion, reinforcing that certain operational details, whether sensitive or unexplained, were not to be disclosed even decades later. The disappearance influenced future Arctic deployments, prompting revised procedures for monitoring, emergency protocols, and contingency planning for isolated stations. Lessons drawn from the Severnaya Zemlya detachment-shaped Cold War-era polar strategy, including improved communication redundancies, better equipment calibration, and stricter rotation schedules to reduce exposure to environmental hazards. Despite these measures, the detachment's fate remained a reference point for both cautionary instruction and the enduring mysteries of Arctic operations. Despite thorough documentation and meticulous searches, the fate of the weather detachment remains an unresolved question, lingering in Cold War archives as a silent warning. Log entries, communications attempts, and patrol reports provide a fragmented narrative that hints at struggle and persistence, yet they reveal nothing definitive about the detachment's outcome. The silence left behind is both a testament to the Arctic's unforgiving nature and a reminder of how even highly trained teams could disappear without explanation. The Severnaya Zemlya detachment vanished into the frozen expanse, leaving only fragments of data and unanswered questions to drift across the Arctic silence. The under-ice listening post that went quiet. Beneath nearly 2 meters of shifting Arctic ice, the listening post transmitted its routine sonar sweeps, unaware that something had begun to disrupt its mechanical heartbeat. Positioned in a narrow channel where currents intersected and ice flows converged, the station had been designed for maximum acoustic sensitivity, capable of detecting submarines and underwater vessels at considerable distances. Its construction was a technical feat. Reinforced compartments housed hydrophones and signal processors, all anchored to withstand ice pressure and the constant threat of shifting ice. Despite these precautions, the Arctic environment remained an unpredictable adversary, and the post's fate would soon illustrate that even the most advanced system could encounter the inexplicable. Built to detect undersea movement and track naval activity, the station was equipped with hydrophones, reinforced compartments, and automated data relays to ensure continuous operation. The Cold War had intensified the need for under-ice monitoring, and Severnaya Zemlya's channels offered strategic vantage points for observing Soviet and NATO submarine activity. Remote engineers designed the station to function with minimal human intervention, relying on automated adjustments to compensate for temperature swings and ice movements. Even with these redundancies, the station depended on the regular oversight of support crews aboard nearby vessels, who verified data streams and ensured the hydrophones remained submerged at precise depths. Every day, technicians monitored the streams of acoustic information, comparing readings against historical patterns and logging each anomaly with meticulous precision. They recorded the subtle hum of distant machinery, the low-frequency vibrations of ice cracking, and even the faint sounds of shifting currents. Logbooks captured every detail, noting deviations in frequency, amplitude, and timing. The work demanded unwavering focus, as small irregularities could signal either a technical problem or a critical strategic event. Analysts on shore reviewed these transmissions, using them to predict ice movements and anticipate potential military activity across the Arctic Seaway. The surrounding ice and water created extreme conditions, with crushing pressures, sub-zero temperatures, and intermittent daylight complicating both equipment reliability and human oversight. Seasonal darkness enveloped the region for months, limiting visual confirmation and forcing reliance on sensors alone. Ice expansion and contraction stressed cables and structural supports, while underwater currents created shifting acoustic profiles that technicians struggled to interpret. Even routine maintenance was perilous. Icebreaker crews faced hidden ridges and open leads while transporting spare parts or personnel. In such an environment, the line between operational normalcy and disaster was perilously thin. A sudden, subtle distortion appeared in the acoustic data, brief and irregular, suggesting either environmental interference or an unforeseen technical fault. The anomaly was unlike previous fluctuations, inconsistent with tide shifts or known ice movements. Analysts noted that the signal pattern deviated from all prior reference material, yet could not identify a concrete cause. Field operators speculated on equipment resonance, transient pressure waves, or even interference from marine life, but no definitive explanation emerged. The station's readings, once predictable and stable, now hinted at a disruption that would soon escalate into silence. Attempts by Central Command to restore normal communications involved multiple frequencies, repeated sonar pings, and coordination with nearby icebreakers, yet all connections remained fragmented. Technicians on the support vessels reported static, partial acknowledgements, and occasional bursts of garbled signals. Each failed attempt increased concern, and contingency protocols were enacted to send additional personnel and equipment for on-site inspection. Every effort underscored the difficulty of working beneath thick ice, or even a short journey across fractured floes could become a dangerous endeavour. Declassified logs reveal sensor irregularities, unexplained mechanical pauses, and intermittent system restarts that were never fully resolved, leaving analysts with only partial insight. Engineers noted brief blackouts in the power supply, occasional anomalies in hydrophone calibration, and sudden drops in signal fidelity. Despite repeated checks and adjustments, the post returned only partial data before cutting out entirely. Internal correspondence reflects frustration at the inability to diagnose the failure conclusively, with some notes redacted entirely, leaving modern researchers to speculate on what might have occurred. Reconnaissance teams were deployed across the ice to examine the station, navigating fractured ice sheets, hidden pressure ridges, and whiteout conditions that slowed their approach. Helicopters and snowmobiles moved cautiously. While icebreaker support maintained position in nearby channels, every attempt to visually inspect the post was hindered by harsh weather, limited accessibility, and the ever-present danger of falling into hidden crevasses. Even after reaching the site, teams reported no clear signs of damage or tampering, adding to the unease surrounding the station's abrupt cessation of communication. Other Arctic listening posts had faced occasional malfunctions, yet none had ceased operation entirely without explanation, making this silence particularly striking in the broader operational context. Comparisons with similar installations showed that minor anomalies were typically resolved quickly, with technicians able to restore full functionality. The absolute absence of data from this post remained unprecedented. Analysts repeatedly emphasized that environmental factors alone could not fully account for the total communication blackout, heightening the sense that something beyond ordinary technical failure had occurred. Post-event evaluations noted possibilities ranging from technical failure to undetected environmental phenomena, though large sections of internal reports were redacted and remain inaccessible. Hypotheses included sub-ice collapses, magnetic interference, and undetected equipment malfunctions, yet none could be conclusively proven. The combination of operational secrecy, harsh conditions, and incomplete data left the post's disappearance an enduring enigma. Even decades later, the files convey tension, showing how meticulously the Cold War monitored Arctic operations while simultaneously acknowledging limits imposed by nature and technology. Lessons drawn from the incident led to changes in under-ice monitoring protocols, emphasizing redundancy, automated alerts, and more rigorous contingency planning for remote stations. New hydrophone arrays were deployed with multiple backup systems, and communication protocols were revised to include repeated cross-checks with surface vessels. Analysts also incorporated lessons about environmental effects on acoustic signals, adjusting interpretation methods and training for potential anomalies. The incident became a reference point for Arctic strategy, underscoring that even the most sophisticated technology is vulnerable in extreme isolation. Even decades later, the station's abrupt disappearance from the data stream serves as a cautionary example of how the Arctic can obscure both human and technological presence. Reports, logs, and declassified annotations provide glimpses of normalcy, interrupted by an unexplained silence, leaving a stark reminder of the challenges inherent in polar surveillance. The Arctic, with its shifting ice, hidden channels, and relentless cold, remains a domain where certainty is rare, and even the most advanced installations can vanish from observation without a trace. The under-ice listening post fell silent without warning, leaving an empty expanse of frozen water to guard the secrets it had once faithfully recorded. The patrol that found warm ground in permafrost. As the patrol moved across the snowbound plain, unusual softness underfoot immediately suggested a departure from the expected rigidity of permafrost. What had begun as routine reconnaissance quickly transformed into a careful survey, as each step revealed subtle shifts in the terrain that hinted at an unseen heat source beneath the frozen surface. The region was known for its deep, solid permafrost, and the patrol had prepared for every challenge the Arctic could impose. Yet nothing in their training had anticipated encountering ground that yielded beneath boots and tracked vehicles in the dead of winter. Their mission had been to map and document terrain for both strategic and environmental purposes, recording every anomaly with precision. Cold War Arctic patrols often doubled as scientific expeditions, gathering geophysical data alongside tactical intelligence. These dual objectives demanded meticulous observation and record-keeping. Survey lines were carefully marked, photographs taken, and environmental measurements logged to ensure that any irregularity could be contextualized within a larger map of the permafrost zone. Even minor deviations were considered significant in the high-stakes atmosphere of Arctic exploration. Normally, the landscape resisted even the sharpest footsteps, with ice-laden soil that held steady under heavy boots and tracked vehicles. Snow covered the surface in uniform sheets, masking small cracks or fissures, yet the patrol could sense the difference through tactile feedback and subtle sinking. Instruments that measured soil density confirmed what the senses already detected. The ground in one small area was anomalously soft. This subtle irregularity created a tension between routine operation and the unknown, forcing the patrol to approach the site with both caution and curiosity. A subtle steam rose from a fissure in the ground, visible only in the cold morning light, hinting at an unseen heat source beneath. It was barely perceptible, almost swallowed by the wind and ambient Arctic haze, yet it marked a physical manifestation of the anomaly. Officers documented its location, the orientation of the fissure, and the behaviour of the surrounding snow and ice. Even small signs such as accelerated snowmelt near the warm soil were carefully logged. The rising vapour suggested an energy source below, the origin of which remained a mystery to both the patrol and the analysts who would later review the reports. Instruments were recalibrated repeatedly, confirming that thermometers and soil sensors consistently recorded temperatures far above the surrounding frozen terrain. Multiple readings from different instruments corroborated the anomaly, ruling out technical malfunction or operator error. The patrol established a temporary perimeter around the warm ground to allow for systematic measurement, probing soil depth, texture, and moisture content. Repeated tests emphasized that this was no ordinary thaw. The anomaly was localized, persistent, and anomalous in the context of regional permafrost conditions. Geologists later noted that permafrost occasionally harbors localized warmth due to geothermal activity or subsurface water movement, though such occurrences were rare in this region. The Arctic's thin crust and past volcanic activity offered theoretical explanations, yet no known geothermal source aligned with the patrol's coordinates. Hydrogeological reports suggested that subsurface water channels could carry residual heat, but the stability and consistency of the readings hinted at something more enigmatic. The patrol's discovery challenged existing assumptions about the uniformity of permafrost in this sector of the Arctic. Unusual mineral deposits discovered on the surface further complicated the patrol's assessment, with small concentrations of iron and sulfur-rich compounds hinting at potential geothermal activity far below the ice. Soil samples were carefully collected and bagged for later chemical analysis, revealing subtle differences in composition compared to nearby permafrost that remained frozen. These variations suggested that the anomaly might not be solely thermal in nature, but part of a more complex interplay between subterranean heat, mineral content, and water movement beneath the Arctic crust, offering a tantalizing scientific puzzle for both geologists and military analysts alike. Carefully navigating around the anomaly, the explorers observed variations in soil texture, sparse vegetation, and signs of thaw that contrasted sharply with the frozen surroundings. Small tufts of hardy Arctic plants appeared near the warm patch, their roots unnaturally flexible in comparison to the brittle flora elsewhere. Snow surrounding the area melted unevenly, revealing jagged edges in the ice that hinted at gradual erosion or shifting underlying layers. Every observation was documented with precise coordinates, photographs, and sketches, creating a meticulous record for further analysis. Cross-referencing records and Arctic survey data revealed no similar thermal irregularities in the mapped grid, underscoring the peculiarity of the discovery. The patrol consulted prior expedition logs and satellite data where available, comparing the area with previously recorded thermal gradients. Nothing in the historical record suggested that this region had ever exhibited such warmth. Even minor anomalies noted in distant sectors were inconsistent with the condition observed here, heightening the sense that the patrol had encountered a unique, isolated phenomenon. Messages relayed to Central Command faced delays and static interference, leaving analysts to interpret incomplete data streams while the patrol continued its investigation. Radio communications were hindered by atmospheric conditions, auroral activity, and topographical interference, which often distorted or delayed transmissions. Analysts on shore received fragmented reports, piecing together the anomaly through partial sensor data and the patrol's descriptive logs. The communication gaps mirrored the uncertainty surrounding the anomaly itself, amplifying tension and the sense that the Arctic could conceal far more than mere geography. Strategists and scientists recognized the anomaly's significance, weighing both environmental insights and operational concerns in the context of Cold War Arctic monitoring. A patch of warm ground could imply potential instability for vehicles, structures, or future installations, making its location a matter of practical importance. Simultaneously, it raised scientific questions about Arctic geology, permafrost composition, and the possibility of unrecorded thermal processes. The patrol's discovery bridged the domains of military strategy and natural science, forcing planners and researchers to confront the unknown with a careful, methodical approach. Safety protocols required the patrol to mark and document the site carefully, maintaining distance while capturing every observable detail to prevent potential hazards. Flags, GPS coordinates, and detailed sketches created a perimeter around the warm area. Vehicles and personnel avoided crossing the patch directly, minimizing the risk of sinking or destabilizing the soil. Observations included both macro-level patterns and micro-level phenomena, ensuring that future expeditions would have comprehensive data for study and risk assessment. Even after days of observation, the origin and extent of the warm ground remained unresolved, leaving the patrol with questions that stretched beyond conventional understanding. No immediate threats were detected, yet the anomaly persisted in defying explanation, challenging assumptions about Arctic uniformity. Subsequent studies would reference the patrol's logs, yet large portions of the event remained obscure, as if the land itself had concealed its secret from human inquiry. The patch of unexpected warmth lingered beneath the permafrost, a silent reminder that even in the most frozen landscapes, the Earth can defy expectation. The radar array officially abandoned, yet still emitting signals. Signals that should have long since ceased pulsed faintly across the patrol's receivers, raising immediate suspicion. The array had been marked inactive in official documents, its decommissioning routine and widely noted in Cold War operational logs. Yet here it was, decades later, sending out bursts of electromagnetic energy that cut through the Arctic stillness with a persistence that demanded scrutiny. For the patrol, the anomaly was unsettling. It suggested that the line between officially recorded history and real-time observation could be far more ambiguous than any record indicated. The unit had been assigned to monitor electronic activity along the northern sectors, a task as routine as it was critical during Cold War operations. Regular sweeps of the Arctic's northern reaches were conducted to detect any unannounced installations, shifts in Soviet monitoring, or atmospheric phenomena that could interfere with navigational or communications equipment. Patrols were trained to approach anomalies with methodical caution, documenting each finding meticulously, and this duty now focused their attention on a pulse that should not exist. Official records indicated that the radar array had been decommissioned years earlier, its towers left to the Arctic winds and ice. Constructed during the height of Cold War tension, the array had once been part of an intricate network designed to provide early warning of air or missile activity over polar routes. After years of operation, structural fatigue and technological obsolescence led to its formal closure, leaving a site ostensibly silent and unmonitored. Yet the patrol's instruments suggested that abandonment had not guaranteed inactivity. Early measurements revealed persistent blips at irregular intervals, their frequencies matching no known atmospheric or cosmic sources. The patrol technicians noted that the pulses appeared patterned, sometimes brief, sometimes lingering, as if the radar's logic circuits still executed old routines despite the absence of human oversight. Every recorded pulse was logged, its strength, timing and direction meticulously charted to create a comprehensive picture of activity in what was supposed to be a dead zone. Each reading was carefully repeated, instruments recalibrated, and antennas adjusted to rule out technical error or transient interference. Static, auroral activity, and cosmic background noise were all systematically eliminated as potential explanations. The patrol even compared readings with remote monitoring posts, discovering that the signal was isolated to this array alone. The diligence of their process reflected both Cold War discipline and a genuine fascination with an event that seemed to defy standard engineering expectations. When the patrol reached the site, they encountered skeletal towers coated in frost and snow, yet somehow still emanating coherent pulses. Rust and ice had accumulated on the framework, wires drooped under weight and antennas sagged, yet equipment panels still occasionally flickered. The juxtaposition of visible decay and invisible operation unsettled the team, suggesting that some hidden mechanism, perhaps solar accumulators or residual generators, kept the system partially alive. The patrol approached cautiously, knowing that the Arctic could conceal both natural and technological hazards alike. Efforts to decipher the signals included cross-referencing historical operating parameters, scanning for hidden transmitters, and consulting technical manuals from the array's operational period. Analysts in the field attempted to determine whether the radar was broadcasting standard detection sweeps, encrypted communication pulses, or an unintentional residual signal. Nothing in the operational archives offered a precedent for a facility retaining partial activity without maintenance or power intervention, leaving both theory and practical experience in uneasy tension. Unusual thermal readings around the base of the radar towers suggested that hidden heaters or residual generators might still operate beneath the ice, contradicting expectations that all power sources had been removed or dismantled. Patrol members noted subtle temperature differences in the snow and metal structures, which could not be attributed to ambient sunlight or atmospheric conditions. Field thermometers and infrared scans detected a consistent, localized warmth at junction boxes and conduit bases, hinting at mechanisms still generating energy. This discovery deepened the mystery, raising questions about whether the array had been intentionally left partially active or if its design allowed certain components to persist autonomously. An unexpected acoustic signature accompanied the radar pulses, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate through the frozen ground and ice, perceptible even without instruments. The patrol recorded this subtle hum, which aligned with the timing of the radar bursts, and theorized it might be caused by mechanical oscillations of old antenna motors or the interaction of electromagnetic fields with metallic structures. Attempts to isolate and dampen the noise failed, reinforcing the notion that the site retained operational energy in some form. This auditory phenomenon, rarely noted in decommissioned arrays, added another layer of intrigue to an already inexplicable set of observations. Nearby decommissioned arrays had gone silent, emphasizing that the persistence of this signal defied precedent and standard engineering expectations. These installations had aged, failed, and ceased operation as expected, illustrating the anomaly's singularity. The patrol recognized that the continued emissions were not a generic byproduct of Arctic technology aging, but a localized, extraordinary phenomenon that raised questions about the array's construction, design redundancy, or perhaps deliberate clandestine reactivation. Communications with Central Command were fragmented, with partial acknowledgements hinting at classified knowledge yet failing to clarify the anomaly. Reports were received sporadically, often abbreviated and cryptically worded, leaving the patrol to interpret gaps while continuing observation. The ambiguity of official responses heightened tension, suggesting either bureaucratic caution or the existence of undisclosed operations linked to the array. Meanwhile, the pulses continued, oblivious to human oversight or official paperwork. Analysts speculated on both practical and strategic implications, from equipment failure to covert reactivation for monitoring, but no explanation fully accounted for the phenomenon. The persistence of the signal could indicate a hidden purpose, a self-sustaining automated system, or an unusual interaction with environmental conditions. Military and scientific minds both weighed in, exploring hypotheses involving Arctic weather patterns, residual power cells, and electromagnetic reflection, yet the anomaly refused simple classification. The patrol marked the area, documented every pulse, and established safe perimeters, maintaining rigorous protocol in a landscape where the signal's origin remained obscure. Each measurement was logged, coordinates carefully recorded, and photographs taken to ensure future expeditions would have a reliable reference. The team navigated the decaying site cautiously, aware that structural instability could compound the already mysterious presence of active signals. Every observation added depth to a puzzle that seemed to blend history, technology, and the Arctic environment into a single enigmatic phenomenon. Even after prolonged observation, the radar pulses continued with steady persistence, a ghostly presence in a facility officially deemed inactive. The anomaly remained, inscrutable yet undeniable, a signal that refused to conform to expectations or authority. It reminded the patrol that in the Arctic, abandonment did not necessarily mean silence, and technology could outlive human oversight in ways that challenged comprehension. In the desolate Arctic silence, abandoned technology continued to broadcast secrets that no human record could fully explain. The ice drift that carried classified equipment ashore. Unexpected shapes emerged along the coastline, their outline betraying the presence of objects no patrol should have encountered in this remote stretch of the Arctic. As the team approached, it became clear that these were not natural formations, but carefully constructed metal crates and containers partially buried in snow and ice. Their presence an immediate enigma. Patrol logs later noted that the area had been considered uninhabited for months, with no scheduled missions passing near this section of the frozen shore. The unusual discovery set a tense tone, the combination of remoteness and the apparent military provenance of the objects immediately raising questions of both security and mystery. Metal cases and crates, each stamped with cryptic numbers and symbols, hinted at military operations far beyond the patrol's immediate understanding. Some bore faint labels with embossed serial codes, while others were unmarked, as if intentionally obscured. The patrol observed signs of deliberate fastening and reinforced corners, suggesting that the equipment was designed to endure harsh Arctic conditions, yet its presence now in such an isolated place was wholly unaccounted for. Every detail, from the weight of the containers to their frost-laden handles, seemed to reinforce the idea that the items were both important and deliberately concealed. Historical Arctic supply records confirmed that similar equipment had once been transported through these regions, though no current mission accounted for such a delivery. Documents declassified decades later indicated that Cold War-era reconnaissance teams often used ice floes as natural transit routes, deliberately allowing cargo to drift to predetermined coordinates for later recovery. Yet the patrol's files showed no record of any mission scheduled in this sector, deepening the mystery. The discrepancy suggested either a forgotten operation, miscalculation, or, more unnervingly, that the equipment had travelled beyond human planning. Blinding winds and brittle ice made every approach uncertain, forcing careful navigation to avoid hidden crevasses and shifting snowdrifts. Each step toward the debris required balance and attention. The patrol was acutely aware that a single misstep could lead to disaster. Visibility was often reduced to mere meters, forcing reliance on both compasses and improvised visual markers to guide movements. The patrol's endurance and observational skills were tested continuously, blending the tension of discovery with the physical challenge of operating in an unforgiving environment. Close examination revealed labels and serial numbers that could be cross-referenced with Cold War inventories, offering tantalizing clues about their origin. Several crates were linked to Arctic intelligence operations conducted in the late 1950s and early 1960s, equipment designed for signals collection and remote monitoring. Others bore markings that were unrecognizable in the patrol's manuals, hinting at specialized devices perhaps never publicly documented. Each piece of evidence required careful notation, as the slightest error could compromise both security and historical accuracy. Investigators confirmed that several containers held sensitive instruments, designed for intelligence or surveillance, whose exposure could have serious consequences. Field tests showed that some devices retained internal power sources, though partially drained, and others displayed wiring consistent with early electronic monitoring systems. The implications were clear. What had drifted ashore could reveal operational secrets long considered lost, and the patrol had to balance caution with the urgent need for documentation. Tracking the ice flow required combining satellite imagery with historic ocean current data, suggesting the objects had travelled vast, unpredictable distances. Analysts attempted to reconstruct the likely path using ice drift modelling, factoring in wind velocity, seasonal thaw cycles, and salinity gradients in nearby waters. These models indicated that the equipment may have originated hundreds of kilometres from its final resting point, moving slowly and silently across the Arctic expanse for months. The realisation that natural forces had effectively transported classified cargo without human intervention added a chilling layer of unpredictability. Unusually, some containers showed signs of minor corrosion and faint frost patterns indicating intermittent exposure to open water, suggesting they had broken free from the ice at certain points during their drift. Analysts noted that these marks could indicate moments when the ice surrounding the equipment fractured or melted, briefly allowing seawater to touch the cargo. Such findings aligned with documented seasonal ice thinning in Arctic drift patterns, offering evidence that natural forces, rather than human error, were primarily responsible for the unpredictable path of these sensitive items. This subtle environmental fingerprint provided investigators with additional clues about the cargo's journey and highlighted the Arctic's dynamic and often hazardous influence on Cold War-era operations. Nearby, smaller debris and anomalous markings suggested additional operations might have been conducted here, leaving lingering questions about what else could have drifted unseen. The patrol noted traces of ropes, metal fragments, and canvas remnants, evidence of earlier landings or abandoned equipment. Some fragments bore markings similar to those on the crates, while others seemed entirely unrelated, as though they belonged to unknown missions. These findings amplified the sense that the Arctic remained a repository of forgotten and potentially dangerous artifacts, concealed beneath the ice and snow. Messages sent to command were terse and coded, reflecting the urgency of reporting the discovery while maintaining strict secrecy protocols. Communications emphasized both the security risk and the remote location, requesting guidance on recovery procedures while ensuring that the information would not be intercepted. The patrol carefully documented every transmission, aware that the clarity and precision of their reporting could determine how successfully the operation would preserve these historical and sensitive materials. Each item was methodically documented, logged, and prepared for transport, with Arctic safety and security procedures dictating every action. Containers were reinforced, numbered, and double-checked for contents, while the team coordinated retrieval using sleds and temporary staging points. Even the smallest misstep could compromise the integrity of the equipment or risk exposure to unauthorized personnel. The combination of meticulous procedure and environmental hazards created a tense, deliberate pace that underscored the gravity of the discovery. Further review suggested that the incident illustrated the Arctic's power to disrupt even carefully planned military logistics, leaving questions about potential undiscovered materials. Drift currents, melting ice, and seasonal storms were all capable of moving equipment beyond human prediction, effectively allowing nature to become an unintentional operator in sensitive operations. The fact that items could resurface decades later, in locations far removed from their original deployment, highlighted both the unpredictability of the Arctic and the resilience of the equipment itself. Even after recovery, the patrol could not dismiss the possibility that more classified equipment was still adrift, hidden somewhere along the shifting ice. Observers noted that ice ridges and cracks could conceal smaller containers, and that ongoing thawing and refreezing cycles might release them in future years. Each discovery reinforced the idea that the Arctic environment retained agency over human operations, its currents quietly moving the traces of the past through isolation and time. Invisible currents continued to carry secrets across the Arctic, their ultimate fate unknown, and their discovery left to chance alone. The Arctic convoy that logged the same coordinates for days. An impossible sameness in its coordinates began recording in the convoy's logs on a frigid stretch of the Arctic Ocean. For several days, multiple vessels appeared to hover over the same point, their instruments stubbornly reporting no movement despite continuous engine output. Officers initially attributed the anomaly to a mechanical malfunction, but repeated calibrations failed to resolve the apparent stasis. The logs themselves became objects of scrutiny, copied, compared, and recopied, yet they confirmed an unyielding truth. The convoy had not moved, at least according to its instruments. Sailors on deck compared the motion of the ice with the unchanged positions, raising questions that went unspoken in official reports. The drifting floes seemed to pass beneath the hulls as if time itself had slowed, while seasoned navigators began to doubt their own perception. Several men reported noticing slight visual cues suggesting movement, yet the instruments continued to insist upon immobility, creating a subtle tension that crept through daily operations. Conversations in the mess hall grew quieter and cautious, each sailor acutely aware that their own eyes appeared to contradict the recorded truth. High-resolution radar imagery captured subtle distortions in the ice pack, hinting at forces that might have disrupted navigation. Analysts reviewing the radar charts decades later noted slight interference patterns, irregular echoes that could suggest either unusual ice formations or unknown geomagnetic phenomena. No evidence suggested deliberate tampering, and environmental explanations, solar storms, magnetic anomalies, shifting currents, were catalogued alongside technical observations. Yet none of the data fully reconciled why the convoy's instruments collectively insisted upon static coordinates. Instruments were meticulously examined, yet compasses, chronometers, and radar repeatedly confirmed the static location without error. Engineers aboard each vessel conducted multiple tests under controlled conditions, aligning devices with external celestial and terrestrial references. Even cross-checks with handheld devices produced consistent results. The coordinates were unwavering. These findings were quietly logged in technical appendices, later released in declassified files with portions redacted, leaving gaps that remain unexplained. Whispers in the crew quarters suggested speculation of unseen influences, as tension quietly grew among those tasked with maintaining the ship's course. Some suggested the anomaly was the result of magnetic interference. Others feared that intelligence operations might have involved experimental technology. Despite the discomfort, officers maintained an official calm, ensuring that the crew remained on schedule while subtly noting the growing unease in private reports. These internal observations were rarely discussed outside command circles, contributing to a sense of secrecy and muted anxiety among the crew. Commanders documented their uncertainty in confidential reports, offering divergent explanations that range from environmental anomaly to unexplained phenomena. Some entries speculated on unusually strong eddies beneath the ice, capable of shifting masses of water without visible surface movement. Others noted that atmospheric conditions could have warped instrumentation readings, particularly during polar nights with unusual auroral activity. Each explanation was methodically considered, yet all left an unanswered question at the heart of the anomaly. Why would several vessels remain locked in a single position for days? Comparative research of prior Arctic expeditions uncovered isolated instances of similar navigational stasis, though none as precise or prolonged as this convoy. Historical records revealed cases of ice-locked vessels and delayed drift patterns, yet in each example, measurements eventually returned to expected values. The consistency and duration of the convoy's frozen coordinates remained unmatched, making this an outlier even in the meticulously documented history of Arctic patrols. Declassified files suggest that senior officials regarded the incident as notable, though never fully resolved, hinting at a possible understanding that has since been lost or deliberately withheld. Curiously, the convoy's radio transmissions during the period of stasis revealed subtle fluctuations in signal strength that confounded communications officers. Even as all vessels reported identical coordinates, shortwave operators noticed that messages occasionally carried slight delays or faint distortions, as though an invisible barrier or interference subtly interacted with the signals. Technical logs later indicated these irregularities were minor but consistent, appearing only while the ships were within the frozen coordinates, then disappearing once the convoy resumed normal navigation. Analysts reviewing declassified files speculated that this phenomenon might indicate localized magnetic anomalies or unusual ionospheric conditions, hinting at a layered and still unexplained interaction between environmental forces and communication systems. Magnetic readings and ocean current analyses provided potential hints, yet every hypothesis failed to fully account for the repeated coordinates. Data from nearby monitoring stations showed minor fluctuations in geomagnetic activity, which might influence compasses, but the instruments on board all registered normal values. Oceanographic reports indicated currents moving in unusual directions, yet none were sufficient to hold multiple vessels motionless. Each scientific avenue added layers of complexity rather than clarity, turning the investigation into a tangle of partially explained forces that refused to converge on a single solution. A nearby reconnaissance vessel recorded the convoy seemingly adrift, its instruments mirroring the exact positions logged by the main fleet. Observers noted slight movements in ice patterns around the hulls, yet no measurable drift was recorded, creating a visual and instrumental paradox. The reconnaissance crew filed reports that were later partially redacted, leaving historians and analysts with tantalizing fragments suggesting the anomaly was both observed and deliberately obscured. These documents underscore the persistent uncertainty that surrounded the convoy's coordinates and highlight the level of secrecy maintained during Cold War Arctic operations. Internal memos noted that portions of data had been redacted, leaving the event shrouded in ambiguity and official uncertainty. Analysts reviewing the files decades later described numerous blacked-out sections suggesting that certain technical or strategic details were withheld. Whether these omissions were meant to conceal intelligence activities, experimental technology, or simply unresolved questions remains a matter of speculation. The redactions contribute to the enduring mystery, transforming a navigational anomaly into a story that spans decades without resolution. By the end of the operation, crew behaviour had shifted subtly. Each manoeuvre was measured and cautious against the persistent enigma of immobile navigation. Routine drills were performed with heightened attention, and officers emphasised cross-checking every reading. Men grew quiet during patrols, glances exchanged silently whenever instruments were consulted. The psychological weight of repeated coordinates left an imprint on the crew, a subtle reminder that in the Arctic, even the most precise technology could yield the inexplicable. Later archival assessments framed the incident as a rare and puzzling convergence of Arctic conditions, equipment behaviour, and human observation. Researchers have speculated that the anomaly may never be fully understood, and attempts to replicate the conditions with modern technology have produced inconsistent results. This event remains a touchstone for Arctic patrol studies, cited for its unusual combination of the environmental, mechanical, and human factors. Its documentation, preserved in fragments and redacted files, continues to intrigue historians and Arctic specialists alike. Over the ice-laden sea, the convoy's coordinates remained unwavering, a silent riddle beneath the Arctic sky. The disappearance of Patrol Dog Team Echo. The frozen reaches of the high Arctic have always resisted human understanding, a stark landscape where silence rules obedience and storms can erase entire patrol routes without warning. Among the obscured edges of Cold War history lies a report fragment from a Canadian Ranger dog sled patrol, known only by its radio call sign, Echo. A team whose routine compass bearings became impossible to reconcile with their last recorded coordinates, and whose final transmissions dissolved into static and absence long before expected relief parties arrived. This chapter examines that disappearance through declassified files and the context of Arctic sovereignty missions in the mid-20th century, when the Canadian Rangers were establishing presence patrols across the vast northern expanse in cooperation with military exercises and civilian observers. Canadian Ranger patrols were irregular and dispersed, often comprised of local Indigenous members whose intimate knowledge of sea ice, wind patterns, and survival techniques made them indispensable in a region where conventional military units struggled to adapt. These patrols regularly traversed hundreds of kilometres, reporting on ice conditions, sovereign markers, and emergent hazards, and they frequently relied on traditional dog sleds, known as kamutiks, when mechanised transport was unreliable or unavailable. Dog teams in the Arctic were not merely a nostalgic holdover, they were crucial tools of mobility and endurance, capable of hauling supplies and navigating terrain that could confound engines and heavy equipment. The historical record of sled dog patrols in northern Canada is extensive but uneven, tracing back to the early 20th century when the Royal Northwest Mounted Police and later the RCMP used dog teams to serve isolated communities and enforce law across the far north. By the Cold War era, the iconic image of a musher and his team remained embedded in official doctrine for its practical merits, even as the Canadian Armed Forces expanded their Arctic operations. Exercises like Operation Nanook periodically brought military units together with Rangers to rehearse sovereignty tasks and emergency responsiveness in brutally cold and remote conditions. Details of Patrol Dog Team Echo's composition are sparse in the archive, but the pattern of Ranger patrols at the time offers context for their mission profile. Teams typically embarked from small settlements or remote outposts in early winter, charting courses that link terrestrial landmarks to sea ice ridges and weather stations, seeking anomalies in terrain and atmospheric data alike. Echo was expected to relay routine check-ins, confirming waypoints and environmental conditions as they went. Instead, what appears in the files are fragmented compass logs that show a slow deviation from the plotted course into regions of distortion before radio silence takes hold, a puzzle that has gripped analysts reviewing these pages decades later. Navigational uncertainty in the Arctic is a reality rooted in both nature and instrument limitations. Compass reliability can taper near the magnetic poles, where the convergence of field lines introduces variability, a phenomenon long understood by explorers and survey teams alike. Experienced rangers and Inuit guides have historically preferred celestial navigation and landscape cues in such conditions, but official patrol reports must still record compass bearings, particularly when operating in support of military intelligence and cartographic missions. The recorded anomalies attributed to Echo's route raise the question of whether natural geomagnetic fluctuation alone could have obscured their tracks, or whether other, unexplained forces were at play. The logistical demands on a dog sled team were enormous. A typical team might consist of 8 to 12 animals, each trained to maintain a steady pace over drifting snow and ice ridges, hauling communal supplies and emergency gear across a span of white wilderness that could stretch for hundreds of kilometers without habitation. The bond between musher and dogs was more than functional. It was essential to survival, as a well-tuned team could sense changes in weather patterns or detect hidden cracks in the ice before mechanized equipment could. The absence of any confirmed sighting or distress signal from Echo's dogs has only deepened the sense of enigma surrounding the patrol's fate. The declassified dossiers include correspondence between Northern Command posts and district headquarters, references to Echo's last few transmissions that spoke in clipped phrases about irregular magnetic readings and a landscape that seemed to resist mapping. These documents describe attempts to triangulate the patrol's position, noting that each subsequent bearing appeared to shift in a manner inconsistent with known geographic markers. Analysts reviewing this data decades later have speculated about shifting ice flows, geomagnetic anomalies, and solar activity, but none offer a definitive explanation that aligns with the abrupt cessation of communication. Search efforts at the time were constrained by weather and the vastness of the territory. Support aircraft dispatched from southern bases often turned back due to blizzard conditions that reduced visibility to near zero and temperatures that threatened engine failure within minutes. Ground parties organised from neighbouring ranger patrols pushed into the field with sleds and provisions, but they found only irregular tracks that appeared to vanish into snowfields or disordered ice formations. These ambiguous footprints, recorded in official search logs, suggested a route that vanished without a trace, leaving behind no clear path toward resolution. At the same time, Inuit oral histories from communities near the regions in question occasionally allude to sightings of lights on stormy nights or distant howls carried on winds that bore no human signature. While such accounts are fragmentary and anecdotal, they endure in the collective memory of northern residents whose lives are shaped by the rhythms of the Arctic night, and they lend a haunting dimension to the clinical reports that populate the archives. Scholars who analyse these narratives alongside government files emphasise that the human experience of this land cannot be fully captured in logs and transcripts alone. The disappearance of Patrol Dog Team Echo remains unresolved in official records, and the available files conclude with a memorandum recommending further review of navigational equipment and Arctic training protocols. Yet the silence that followed the patrol has echoed through decades of subsequent exploration, a silence that invites both scientific curiosity and speculative unease. In the context of Cold War secrecy and the strategic imperatives that drove Arctic expeditions, the fate of Echo stands as a reminder that not all mysteries yield to explanation, and that the high Arctic retains its own inscrutable logic beyond human control. They vanished into the white, swallowed by endless ice and wind, leaving only the echo of their passage and a silence that no signal, search, or record could ever penetrate. The ice core sample that was quietly removed from records. In the dimly lit vaults of an Arctic research station, a missing ice core stirred confusion among scientists who had followed decades of precise drilling schedules. Records indicated the sample had been extracted as part of a standard stratigraphic survey, yet its removal from official archives left a gap that raised questions about oversight and intent. The files surrounding the core's disappearance are fragmented, revealing only partial chains of custody and cryptic annotations. Within these fragments, there are faint traces of a patrol mission that intersected the research operation, a mission whose exact purpose and scope remain obscured by the passage of time and Cold War discretion. Collecting layers of frozen sediment demanded both patience and resilience, as teams chipped through meters of compacted ice to capture traces of a climate long past. Each stratum recorded seasonal shifts, volcanic activity, and atmospheric composition with remarkable fidelity, allowing scientists to reconstruct centuries of environmental history. The process required extreme care. Drill alignment, temperature stabilization, and immediate preservation were crucial to prevent contamination. Yet the meticulous precision that characterized these operations stands in stark contrast to the unexplained disappearance of this particular sample, a disruption that suggests human decision rather than natural accident or clerical oversight. Those tasked with transporting the sample moved through shifting ice flows, balancing the dual imperatives of scientific observation and the unspoken vigilance of Cold War oversight. These teams often traversed dangerous terrain, carrying both research instruments and sensitive materials intended for analysis at southern laboratories. Every logistical choice, from sled configuration to navigation, was documented, yet the trail of the missing core stops abruptly in reports, leaving only hints of its intended destination. The intersection of military and scientific objectives lent an added layer of secrecy to operations, and the files reflect a tension between procedural transparency and strategic concealment. When archivists later examined the catalogue, a conspicuous absence became apparent, a single entry erased without explanation from the meticulously maintained records. The missing core was not simply misfiled. References to it were excised from logs, annotations blacked out and cross-references removed. Researchers attempting to trace the chain of custody found nothing beyond an unremarkable memo noting core transferred, with no recipient or location specified. This deliberate removal contrasts sharply with standard archival practices, where every sample is meticulously logged. The deletion itself suggests intent, raising questions about who authorized it and why such a seemingly innocuous piece of ice would merit secrecy. The core itself promised rare insights: gases trapped for millennia, mineral strata unbroken by human interference, and chemical signatures that hinted at atmospheric anomalies. Analyses of comparable cores have yielded information about prehistoric temperature fluctuations, volcanic eruptions, and even solar activity cycles. The absent sample could have provided data bridging gaps between other records, or revealed patterns otherwise hidden in climate reconstructions. Its sudden removal implies significance beyond routine research, as though the core held evidence whose implications were deemed sensitive, whether for scientific, political, or strategic reasons. Official correspondence suggested little beyond the removal, often obscured by redactions and vague references to security protocols that offered no clarity to the researchers left behind. Memos referred to restricted transport or archival reassignment, but the files offer no details on rationale or final repository. Scientists attempting to follow up were met with repeated dead ends, their inquiries circling back to the same cryptic notations. The lack of transparency has fueled speculation among historians and Arctic scholars, who note that during the Cold War, even seemingly mundane environmental data could be repurposed for military or geopolitical intelligence, lending an air of plausible secrecy to the anomaly. Subsequent efforts to reproduce the data faltered as weather, ice conditions, and the precise positioning of the original drill site conspired against replication. Seasonal shifts, snow accumulation, and the subtle movement of ice ridges made locating the original drilling coordinates nearly impossible. Even with modern GPS mapping and aerial reconnaissance, researchers found themselves navigating a transformed landscape that bore little resemblance to the terrain described in decades-old logs. Attempts to drill adjacent cores produced material that was similar in composition, but lacked the particular features noted in the missing record, deepening the sense of a lost opportunity frozen in time. Some patrol logs hinted at unusual readings in the surrounding ice, including layers denser than expected and faint disruptions in the crystalline structure that puzzled geologists. Notes mention intermittent magnetic anomalies, slight temperature inversions, and ice compression patterns that defied standard models, yet no clear explanations accompany these observations. The juxtaposition of these subtle anomalies with the sudden removal of the core creates a thread of intrigue. It is as if the landscape itself, in tandem with human action, conspired to keep the sample from reaching full analysis. The files invite speculation, but none can provide certainty. Personnel familiar with the operation spoke in cautious terms about decisions made in secrecy, their recollections partial, yet tinged with apprehension over what had been withheld. Scientists described the following orders without questioning them, documenting every procedural step yet receiving minimal explanation for sudden policy shifts or redacted instructions. Even decades later, some hesitate to discuss the matter, mindful of lingering security classifications or the reputational risks of drawing attention to anomalies that remain officially unacknowledged. Their caution reinforces the aura of deliberate concealment surrounding the vanished core. The archives themselves now speak through silence, redacted pages and blank entries marking where knowledge should have been, the gaps more haunting than any written line. Researchers visiting the repository find meticulous logs interrupted by sudden voids, tables missing numerical entries, and index cards removed from otherwise complete sequences. The absence is tangible, as though the record itself is resisting comprehension, an artifact of both human decision and Arctic isolation. These lacunae compel investigators to confront the notion that not all historical traces endure, and that the process of erasure can be as telling as the preserved material. Across decades, the void left by the missing sample has continued to vex climate researchers and historians alike, a quiet enigma embedded within the broader mysteries of Arctic expeditions. Efforts to piece together narratives from other patrols, drilling missions, and environmental observations yield partial insights but never the complete picture. The missing core stands as a symbol of what can be lost in extreme environments, where human oversight, political agendas, and the Arctic's own unforgiving conditions intersect to obscure the truth. Its absence is a reminder that some scientific mysteries are as much about what disappears as what remains. Shrouded in layers of ice and bureaucracy, that vanished core endures as a silent witness to secrets that may never be fully uncovered. The patrol that detected voices on a dead frequency. Static hummed through the patrol's receivers long before anyone recognized the anomaly, and the first faint words seemed to emerge from channels officially marked silent. At first, the sounds were dismissed as interference, perhaps a glitch in the insulation of their equipment or stray signals bouncing across ice ridges. Yet the clarity persisted through multiple watches, audible even over the wind howling across the frozen expanse. Logs indicate that the patrol attempted to trace the signal, but no triangulation could reconcile the voices with known transmission points. This initial observation introduced a mystery that would confound analysts reviewing declassified Cold War files decades later. Standard Arctic communications relied on carefully designated frequencies, with certain channels intentionally left unused to avoid interference and preserve security, particularly during sovereignty patrols and joint exercises. Dead frequencies were monitored for accidental bleed over, but rarely contained intelligible signals. The fact that this patrol captured coherent voices on one such channel posed a technical anomaly of significant concern. Researchers reviewing similar Cold War-era Arctic signal operations have noted that the combination of ionospheric conditions and long-distance reflection rarely produces stable audio. The persistence of these transmissions suggested a phenomenon that eluded conventional explanation, blending natural physics and unexplored possibilities. The receivers were state-of-the-art for their time, mounted on sled frames with insulated wiring and backup power, each meticulously logged to ensure every transmission could be traced. Operators maintained careful records, noting date, time, temperature, and antenna orientation for each received signal. The patrol also maintained battery cycles and environmental logs, understanding that sub-zero conditions could induce electronic drift or intermittent failures. Despite these precautions, the voices persisted across repeated tests and recalibrations. The anomaly was not an artifact of negligence or mechanical error, leaving personnel and subsequent analysts puzzled over a source that seemed to exist independently of the known physical environment. At first, the voices were indistinct murmurs, fragmented and fleeting, prompting repeated playback and detailed annotation as the patrol struggled to separate signal from ambient noise. Some segments resembled speech patterns, syllables strung together without recognizable words. Others appeared as tonal fluctuations or overlapping frequencies, blurring human perception with the atmospheric interference of Arctic storms. The patrol's notes reflect an increasing fascination mixed with unease, as even the most experienced members acknowledged the impossibility of the source. Each transmission seemed to both beckon and evade comprehension, drawing attention to its unclassifiable origin while offering no resolution. In the nights that followed, the anomalies became more structured, with pauses and repetitions that suggested deliberation, yet no discernible language or origin could be confirmed. Operators began cataloguing the sequence of sounds, noting intervals and amplitude changes as if trying to detect a code. The patterning defied explanations based on machinery, echoes, or natural interference. While the recordings were faint, the regularity implied intentionality. Historians analysing the declassified files have speculated that these signals could represent either atmospheric phenomena that imitate structured communication, or a human, or non-human, source entirely beyond ordinary detection methods. Technical analysis considered the ionosphere, geomagnetic storms, and auroral interference, yet none of these atmospheric phenomena fully accounted for the timing and clarity of the transmissions. Polar regions are known for unique radio propagation effects, including long-distance reflection and sporadic signal bounce, yet the logs show repeatable sequences during periods when such conditions were minimal. The patrol's monitoring equipment performed flawlessly, and temperature logs indicate that cold-induced interference was unlikely. Analysts reviewing the case have noted that, even when accounting for environmental anomalies, the voices remained statistically improbable and operationally inexplicable, adding a layer of intrigue to the event. Beyond scientific curiosity, the context of the Cold War heightened concern, as every unexplained signal in Arctic airspace was scrutinized for potential intelligence activity. Military planners understood that the polar regions could serve as conduits for early warning detection or clandestine transmissions. The fact that these voices appeared on a channel officially unused magnified suspicions, yet no foreign station or Allied monitoring unit reported corresponding activity. The tension between operational security, scientific observation, and the possibility of strategic significance amplified the mystery, illustrating how Cold War paranoia could intersect with genuine unexplained phenomena in remote environments. Winds whipping across ice ridges and snowfields may have amplified faint sounds, yet the recordings persisted even when playback occurred back at distant, insulated stations. Field experiments indicated that reflections from ice hummocks or pressure ridges could distort ambient noise, but the organised, repetitive nature of the voices remained intact. Attempts to simulate the effect under controlled conditions failed, reinforcing the anomaly's singularity. Even minor changes in antenna orientation or patrol location produced minimal alteration in the signal, suggesting that the source was persistent, consistent, and unconstrained by ordinary Arctic topography or meteorology. The human element compounded the unease. Patrol members reported that even familiar voices seemed distorted, and moments of auditory expectation heightened anxiety during otherwise silent watches. The logs reveal that operators questioned their perception, noting episodes where the voices appeared louder when snow conditions were calm and faded when storms increased, as if responding to environmental variables. Fatigue, isolation, and the psychological strain of continuous monitoring likely intensified attention to these anomalies. Yet, the phenomenon persisted despite shifts in personnel, proving that it was neither imagination nor coincidence, but something observed repeatedly and documented with precision. Official logs capture the phenomenon in brief, cryptic notations, with redactions and erased entries hinting at a level of caution or suppression unusual even for routine Arctic operations. Analysts examining declassified documents note the abrupt discontinuity in reporting. Several pages contain erased frequency readings, blanked memo sections, and references to security review. The combination of precise instrumentation, repeated human observation, and selective documentation underscores that the patrol encountered something officially acknowledged, yet left unexplained. The absence of follow-up or cross-referenced investigation adds to the sense of a partially hidden narrative embedded in Cold War intelligence operations. Decades later, the files reveal no definitive explanation, leaving historians and signal analysts to speculate on whether the voices were environmental, technical, or something altogether different. Cross-disciplinary reviews of polar signal anomalies have produced hypotheses ranging from natural ionospheric phenomena to inadvertent cross-channel interference, yet none fully reconcile with the patrol's observations. The enduring uncertainty highlights the Arctic's capacity to confound human expectation, combining isolation, technology, and natural extremity in ways that resist definitive analysis. The incident remains a unique entry in the catalogue of unexplained Cold War Arctic events, preserved only in fragmentary logs and recollections. Far across icy distances and unseen frequencies, the voices persist, a transmission that defies maps, instruments, and all attempts at understanding. The Soviet ice runway that appeared overnight. From the first aerial survey, a rigid strip of ice stood out against the surrounding white, a runway that no previous chart or patrol report had ever recorded. Analysts reviewing declassified Cold War reconnaissance photographs were struck by its sudden appearance in a remote sector of the Arctic, far from established Soviet stations. The strip was linear, meticulously cleared, and aligned with prevailing winds, suggesting deliberate planning. Patrols dispatched to confirm the photographs noted the same pristine surface, unbroken by tracks or equipment, raising immediate questions about its construction and the purpose behind a facility that seemingly materialized overnight in the desolate expanse. Seasonal drift and shifting icebergs typically make the Arctic landscape unpredictable, yet this structure appeared to defy natural patterns, its edges straight and carefully leveled. Surrounding snow hummocks and pressure ridges contrasted sharply with the runway's smooth surface, giving the impression of human intervention on a scale difficult to reconcile with the region's environmental volatility. The stability required for aircraft operations in these conditions is extraordinary, and the alignment suggested an understanding of prevailing winds, snow compaction, and ice density. For observers, it seemed less like an improvised landing strip and more like a carefully engineered installation, executed with precision under extreme constraints. Photographers aboard reconnaissance flights documented the site from multiple angles, capturing high-resolution images that revealed surprisingly precise markings along the ice and snow. The imagery allowed analysts to examine subtle details, clear approach paths, end markers, and faint parallel lines consistent with leveling tools or tracked equipment. Shadows indicated slight elevation changes that might correspond to compacted ice layers, while the surrounding terrain remained undisturbed. These photographs became the foundation for subsequent reviews as the visual evidence starkly contradicted maps and prior patrol reports, cementing the mystery of how such a structure could exist undetected in one of the most remote and inhospitable environments on Earth. Ground patrols dispatched to verify the photographs reported an absence of footprints or equipment nearby, leaving only the smooth surface of a newly prepared strip that suggested rapid construction. Teams noted the lack of supply caches or nearby shelters, elements that would normally accompany Arctic engineering operations. Observers remarked on the eerie quiet of the site, with only the faint hum of distant wind over ice, reinforcing the impression that the runway had appeared without warning or discernible support. The patrols logged their observations meticulously, emphasizing the absence of human activity and the impossibility of conventional construction methods being applied in such an isolated location. Measurements taken from the imagery indicated dimensions consistent with aircraft operations, with cleared approaches and an alignment that implied engineering forethought far beyond improvisation. Analysts compared the width and length to known Soviet aircraft specifications of the era, noting that even smaller cargo or reconnaissance planes would require significant preparation. The precise clearing and maintenance of the surface indicated the use of specialized equipment or expertise, yet no records show any mission capable of creating such a runway. The structural integrity visible from above suggested careful attention to ice thickness, snow removal, and approach gradients, all executed in a way that seemed to bypass both natural and logistical obstacles. Researchers at the time speculated about strategic purposes, noting that even temporary Arctic runways could serve as staging points or emergency landing strips for military missions, though evidence of use remained elusive. Some proposed reconnaissance flights, resupply operations, or contingency landing zones for aircraft operating in polar airspace. Yet no patrol records, flight logs, or satellite imagery confirmed activity on the strip. The ambiguity fueled speculation within intelligence circles as the runway appeared in multiple photographs yet left no signs of operation. This combination of visibility and inactivity heightened the sense of mystery, suggesting intentions that were deliberately concealed or transient in nature. Extreme weather, sub-zero temperatures, and seasonal ice shifts make Arctic construction extraordinarily difficult, raising questions about the logistics required to create a runway without detection. Surface ice can move meters over weeks, snow can accumulate rapidly, and storms frequently erase evidence of human presence. Any construction operation would require the transport of heavy equipment, personnel, and materials, yet none were observed in patrol or satellite records. The improbability of such an undertaking, combined with the strip's sudden appearance, suggests a carefully orchestrated effort conducted under circumstances designed to evade both scientific observation and Cold War reconnaissance. Conflicting notes in patrol logs and aerial reports created ambiguity, as some images showed subtle disturbances that were absent in later flights, suggesting the runway's existence was intermittent or otherwise manipulated. In some cases, shadows and reflections obscured the surface, leading to misinterpretation of ice fissures or snow patterns. Analysts comparing sequential images noted that slight environmental changes could make the runway seem more or less defined, yet no natural phenomenon could account for its initial creation. These contradictions reinforced the notion that the site's appearance was both deliberate and carefully managed, an intentional anomaly within an otherwise well-documented Arctic landscape. Soviet Arctic operations were often shrouded in secrecy, with remote stations, concealed supply caches, and limited public records, leaving little context for the sudden appearance of such a facility. The presence of highly classified logistics hubs and strategic reconnaissance points complicates interpretation, as any activity might have been intentionally omitted from open archives. While official records show routine patrols and research operations, the dearth of corroborating evidence for the runway underscores its uniqueness. Historians and Arctic analysts alike have noted that the combination of remote location, structural precision, and sudden visibility makes this installation an enduring enigma. Declassified photographs show the runway, yet captions, annotations, and follow-up reports are sparse or missing entirely, leaving historians to interpret evidence without guidance from the original observers. The lack of explanatory material in intelligence archives highlights both the secrecy of Soviet Arctic operations and the limitations of external observation during the Cold War. Analysts must rely on indirect measurements, cross-referenced reconnaissance, and environmental assessment to reconstruct a scenario that remains otherwise undocumented. Every detail captured in the images raises more questions than answers, turning each photograph into both evidence and a puzzle. For years, the sudden emergence of the ice runway has remained a puzzling entry in Cold War Arctic files, a reminder that even heavily surveilled regions can conceal remarkable and unexplained activity. Attempts to locate the site in subsequent decades were hampered by shifting ice, snow accumulation, and incomplete mapping, reinforcing the sense that it had existed briefly before receding into obscurity. Scholars examining the Cold War Arctic have cited this instance as a striking example of human presence appearing with no discernible origin or purpose, a brief imprint left on a frozen world that otherwise offers few traces of human passage. Concealed under an expanse of ice, the runway persists as a stark monument to unknown intentions, an imprint of human presence where none should exist. The magnetic anomaly patrol of the Beaufort Sea. Instruments flickered and spun erratically as the patrol advanced across the Beaufort Sea, with compass needles twisting against every known variation, marking the first signs of a strange and persistent anomaly. Patrol logs indicate that the deviations began subtly, just a few degrees at first, but soon became too pronounced to ignore. Officers documented each fluctuation with meticulous care, aware that Arctic navigation demanded precision. The surrounding ice fields appeared ordinary, yet every attempt to plot a consistent course was foiled by the instruments themselves, creating a disorienting tension that persisted even during the sunlit hours of the brief polar day. The Beaufort Sea, a region of drifting ice and unpredictable seasonal currents, is notorious for testing even the most experienced Arctic navigators. Yet this anomaly exceeded ordinary environmental challenges. Ice floes shifted beneath the patrol's sleds, and open lids formed and froze without warning, complicating any attempt to reconcile readings with visual markers. Ocean currents and sub-zero temperatures affected both instruments and human perception, yet the persistent directional distortions seemed concentrated in a localized area, suggesting a phenomenon not entirely explained by natural forces. This contrast between familiar hazards and inexplicable behaviour heightened the patrol's unease. Standard navigation tools, including magnetic compasses and gyrocompasses, were meticulously calibrated, and yet the readings repeatedly contradicted one another, forcing the patrol to double-check each observation. Backup instruments confirmed the anomaly, ruling out mechanical failure or operator error. Logs record multiple cross-checks against sextant observations and dead reckoning calculations, each revealing inconsistencies in orientation and bearing. The equipment functioned according to specification, yet the compass needles wavered unpredictably near a specific drifting ice formation. These discrepancies puzzled officers trained to anticipate Arctic interference, creating a subtle but growing sense that the anomaly was deliberate or otherwise extraordinary. The first detailed log entry describes a sudden divergence of 15 degrees in multiple instruments, an occurrence so precise and repeatable that it could not be dismissed as a mechanical error. The patrol meticulously recorded the time, position and environmental conditions surrounding each spike and deviation. Observers noted that readings would return to near normal values once they moved a few kilometers away, only to reappear when approaching the same sector of ice. These fluctuations were consistent across multiple nights and different patrol teams, underscoring a persistent phenomenon whose origin remained hidden beneath the frozen surface. As the patrol circled the drifting ice field, deviations intensified, creating patterns noted across successive readings that suggested a localized but inexplicable magnetic distortion. Officers began marking positions on maps with repeated annotations, connecting points where compasses swung sharply out of alignment. The irregularity affected navigation to the extent that the patrol temporarily altered its route, relying on landmarks and dead reckoning. Over successive observations, the phenomenon demonstrated both stability and unpredictability. Stable enough to be repeatedly documented, yet impossible to predict with conventional surveying methods, leaving even experienced personnel uncertain how to safely traverse the region. Scientists and analysts considered natural explanations, including concentrations of magnetic minerals beneath the ice, geomagnetic storms, and auroral interference, yet none fully accounted for the anomaly's behaviour. Geological surveys show limited occurrences of magnetic deposits in the Beaufort Sea region, and recorded solar and geomagnetic activity failed to coincide with the observed fluctuations. Patrol engineers confirmed that metal objects and vehicles could not have caused such distortions over the measured area. Each hypothesis left gaps in the explanation, amplifying the sense that the anomaly was simultaneously natural and inexplicable, a phenomenon that resisted conventional understanding. In the tense context of the Cold War, a persistent magnetic irregularity in Arctic waters carried strategic implications, prompting speculation about potential monitoring, navigation interference, or clandestine operations. Patrol officers were trained to consider enemy activity as a potential factor, and any unexplained anomaly could be interpreted as a security concern. Declassified files indicate that analysts reviewed the readings for signs of covert installations or experimental navigation interference, yet no corroborating evidence was ever discovered. The intersection of environmental mystery and military caution heightened the significance of the anomaly, casting the Beaufort Sea as a zone of both scientific and strategic intrigue. Patrol members reported growing unease, describing subtle shifts in perception, disorientation, and reliance on dead reckoning, as instruments failed to provide consistent guidance through the shifting sea ice. The logs capture moments of hesitation, pauses to recalibrate compasses, and careful discussion among officers about whether to continue or reroute. Even with visual confirmation of ice features and distant landmarks, the magnetic deviations undermined confidence in technology, creating a psychological strain that amplified the enigma. The crew's experience reveals how Arctic anomalies can influence human perception as profoundly as mechanical instrumentation. Redactions, erased entries, and ambiguous annotations in the patrol's reports reveal both caution and uncertainty, leaving modern analysts with fragmented evidence of the anomaly's scope and duration. Sections of reports were intentionally obscured, likely reflecting a combination of security concerns and unresolved confusion. Some entries reference the phenomenon in broad terms without providing coordinates or specific measurements, while others show precise readings with no interpretation. The patchwork nature of these files underscores the difficulty of reconstructing events and highlights the lingering uncertainty that defines this Cold War Arctic mystery. Future missions adjusted course and methodology to account for the magnetic irregularity, demonstrating the enduring influence of a phenomenon that could not be mapped or predicted with conventional navigation. Patrol strategies incorporated alternative navigation techniques, including reliance on visual landmarks and celestial observations, while avoiding the core area of anomaly whenever possible. Later Arctic surveys referenced the location in passing, noting the persistent but unexplained deviations without providing explanation. Over time, the anomaly became a benchmark for understanding the intersection of geophysical phenomena and operational limitations in extreme polar environments. Long after its discovery, the Laptov Sea anomaly remains a case study in Arctic geophysical mysteries, its precise origins unresolved despite repeated observation and scientific scrutiny. Researchers continue to reference it when discussing the challenges of navigation in high-latitude regions, and it is cited as an example of how natural phenomena can intersect with human activity in ways that resist interpretation. The anomaly endures not only as a physical occurrence, but as a psychological and operational test, reminding observers that some elements of the Arctic remain fundamentally unknowable. Across drifting ice and uncharted currents, the magnetic force persists, a silent and invisible marker that defies both instruments and human understanding. The recon team that refused to file a final report. When the patrol returned to base, the absence of a final report sent ripples through command, raising questions that would remain unanswered in the logs. Officers found the team physically intact, their equipment in order, and yet the meticulous notes expected from every reconnaissance mission were missing. Initial inquiries revealed only vague entries and partial observations, offering no clarity about what the patrol had encountered or why documentation had been withheld. The silence itself became a point of concern, a procedural anomaly in an otherwise routine Arctic operation, leaving higher authorities unsettled and the reason for a mission shrouded in ambiguity. Planned as a routine operation, the mission had been a reconnaissance of drifting ice channels meant to update charts and verify navigational hazards, yet nothing in its planning suggested future complication. Patrol orders were standard for Cold War Arctic operations, emphasizing observation, environmental assessment, and verification of existing records. There was no expectation of encountering hazards beyond the usual ice shifts, sudden storms, or temporary crevasse formations. Despite the familiarity of the task, the patrol's return without a final report suggested that something unexpected had occurred, something that challenged either their understanding, their instruments, or their confidence in recording it formally. Within the team, hierarchy and experience created subtle tensions. Officers with differing priorities debated each step, and small disagreements quietly shaped how observations were recorded. Senior members favoured caution, adhering to protocol and relying on established navigation methods, while junior officers expressed concern over anomalies they observed firsthand. Personal logs reveal moments of quiet frustration, with personnel questioning whether to annotate irregularities or to remain neutral in their documentation. The interpersonal dynamics created a sense of collective unease, a tension that compounded the challenges imposed by the environment and may have influenced the decision to withhold a complete report. The Arctic environment pressed in relentlessly, with shifting flows and sudden storms challenging both movement and judgment, turning even routine observations into exercises of patience and vigilance. Visibility was often limited, and temperature fluctuations affected both equipment and human performance. The team navigated through constantly changing conditions, noting that ice formations could appear stable one moment and perilous the next. These environmental pressures compounded the psychological burden of the mission, creating a setting where uncertainty was amplified, and the judgment of whether to report or suppress certain observations became increasingly fraught. Early journal entries reveal hesitation in tone, noting minor irregularities and unexplained impressions that, while not alarming individually, accumulated into a sense of unease among team members. Observations of fleeting shadows, subtle noises across the ice, or drift patterns that contradicted expectations were recorded with caution. Officers seemed aware that documenting these phenomena could raise questions beyond their authority or expertise. As the patrol progressed, the cumulative weight of these minor anomalies created an implicit tension that may have informed the ultimate choice to refrain from submitting a full report, a decision that would ripple through command for years. Repeated inconsistencies emerged in log entries and measurement notes, signalling that the patrol had encountered phenomena or circumstances they could not confidently interpret or report. Compass readings occasionally diverged, temperature gauges registered brief, inexplicable spikes, and drift calculations failed to align with expected models. The team meticulously cross-checked each observation, yet the anomalies persisted, creating internal uncertainty. Some entries hint at hesitation, noting observations without conclusions, suggesting that the officers themselves were reluctant to draw firm statements in a context where ambiguity carried potential operational consequences. Deliberation within the team gradually shifted toward inaction, as officers weighed the risks of misrepresentation against the pressure to comply with reporting protocols, ultimately choosing silence over uncertainty. The decision was not made lightly. Logs and personal notes reveal discussions about whether anomalous readings should be submitted, altered, or withheld entirely. By consensus, the team opted for restraint, prioritizing professional caution over procedural completion. This collective choice, unusual in Arctic patrol history, underscores the tension between operational integrity and bureaucratic expectation, and it leaves the precise reasons for their silence an enduring mystery. Command officers requested the final report, reviewing personnel files and sending follow-up inquiries, yet the patrol's deliberate reticence persisted, leaving bureaucrats and analysts equally frustrated and intrigued. Multiple attempts to obtain clarification met with vague responses and partial logs, offering no definitive account of the anomalies or unusual conditions encountered. The absence of explanation created a procedural impasse, forcing higher authorities to note the incident in internal files without resolution. Even decades later, declassified documents show repeated references to the withheld report, yet no evidence exists clarifying the patrol's reasoning or what they may have witnessed. Portions of the declassified files remain redacted or partially erased, suggesting intervention either to obscure sensitive information or to remove ambiguous content, deepening the sense of secrecy. Analysts examining the records note blank spaces, smudged entries, and inconsistently dated observations, leaving gaps that make it impossible to reconstruct the patrol's experience fully. Whether the redactions were intentional by the original command or added later remains uncertain, but the effect is clear. The Arctic Patrol's experience is now preserved more as absence than evidence, with the silence of their report echoing through Cold War archives as a puzzle that defies resolution. The absence of official documentation led to long-term changes in patrol oversight, prompting stricter procedures for submission and verification in subsequent Arctic reconnaissance missions. Command adjusted training and reporting protocols to reduce ambiguity in the field, emphasizing the necessity of recording even uncertain or confusing observations. Lessons drawn from the incident highlight the precarious balance between human judgment, environmental unpredictability, and institutional expectation. Analysts still reference this case when discussing operational risk in remote polar regions, noting how procedural anomalies can persist as enduring enigmas in otherwise structured bureaucratic systems. To this day, historians and analysts remain uncertain what compelled the team to withhold their report, a gap in the record that continues to invite speculation and study. The Arctic landscape remains as inhospitable and enigmatic as it was then, but the true source of the patrol's discretion may never be known. Researchers can only reconstruct fragments, read between redactions, and infer the tension that must have shaped each decision. The incident stands as a testament to the weight of human judgment when confronted with the unknown, preserved in silence more than in words. The silence of the recon team endures across decades, a deliberate absence that whispers of truths no report could ever contain. The declassified photographs that never received captions. Among the shelves of Arctic reconnaissance archives, a series of photographs sits untouched, their frames empty of captions and their subjects left unexplained. Each print carries the weight of Cold War oversight, a fragment of activity frozen in the ice yet stripped of narrative. Analysts browsing the declassified collections encounter nothing but the stark images themselves, devoid of interpretation or attribution. The photographs depict landscapes, equipment, and personnel in fleeting glimpses, yet their purpose and context are obscured, leaving only the unsettling clarity that someone once considered them significant enough to capture, yet not significant enough to explain. The images were captured as part of routine patrol missions, intended to document ice drift, equipment deployment, and temporary field installations across high-latitude regions. Standard operating procedures required such visual records for logistical reference and intelligence verification, yet the uncatalogued prints diverge from the expected order. Some appear to have been taken at irregular intervals, while others display unusual angles or framing choices that suggest either urgency or improvisation. Despite their procedural origin, the photographs now function less as documentation and more as enigmas, testaments to a patrol's presence without confirming its purpose or observations. Detailed scrutiny reveals stark contrasts in terrain: jagged ice ridges, shadowed snowbanks, and the faint outlines of sleds or equipment barely discernible against the white expanse. Occasionally, small figures are captured mid-movement, their roles impossible to identify, their actions suspended between labour and leisure. The horizon often stretches endlessly, with light refracting off the frozen surface in ways that obscure depth and scale. Every image conveys both precision and uncertainty, a record of human activity and environmental extremity simultaneously, leaving the viewer to question whether the significance lies in what was photographed or in what was left out. Archival inconsistencies are immediately apparent, with some negatives missing dates, certain prints duplicated, and others filed with blank or misleading notations that offer no clarity. Handwritten labels are either absent or scrawled with indecipherable codes, while in some cases annotations were later obscured by erasure or overpainting. These gaps suggest intentional obfuscation, yet whether by oversight, bureaucratic error, or deliberate classification remains unclear. Researchers face the challenge of reconciling the images with other Cold War files, often encountering dead ends that deepen the mystery rather than illuminate it. By analysing positioning and surrounding ice formations, researchers infer possible patrol routes and stops, yet every reconstruction remains tentative, constrained by what the images conceal rather than reveal. Tracks in the snow hint at sled movement, while shadows suggest temporary structures that may no longer exist. Some images feature isolated markers, perhaps survey points or signalling devices, their intended function left ambiguous. Even with the aid of satellite overlays and ice charts, the photographs resist definitive interpretation, a frozen narrative written in absence and fragmentary observation. Technical challenges are evident in exposure inconsistencies, blurred edges, and overexposed horizons, a reminder that Arctic light and sub-zero temperatures posed persistent difficulties for early Cold War photography. Lens frost, rapid shifts in daylight, and reflective surfaces frequently distorted the intended subject matter. Yet the imperfections themselves convey information: hurried movements, extreme weather, and the improvisational conditions under which the images were captured. Every visual flaw becomes a subtle clue, hinting at operational pressure, environmental hazard, or both, underscoring the precarious conditions patrols endured to preserve these fragments of the Arctic landscape. The absence of captions suggests deliberate omission, possibly reflecting classified operations, sensitive observations, or events the patrol was never meant to explain to external reviewers. Images of equipment or installations, though mundane in isolation, may have revealed locations, strategies, or technological details deemed too sensitive for standard reporting. Other photographs appear innocuous, yet their repetition or unusual focus hints at priority or concern by those behind the camera. In every frame, the tension between what is recorded and what is withheld becomes tangible, leaving viewers aware that even visual evidence can conceal as much as it reveals. Historians and intelligence analysts attempting to correlate the images with known events encounter repeated dead ends, as few records align with the visual evidence and even fewer confirm its significance. Attempts to match geographic features, equipment types, or personnel with other patrol logs often fail, yielding contradictions or uncertainty. These incongruities suggest either gaps in record-keeping, deliberate concealment, or observations that were considered too ambiguous for formal documentation. The photographs thus become their own archive of enigma, a visual testament to Arctic patrol operations whose meaning remains partially veiled. Viewing the photographs without context evokes a sense of unease. Isolated objects and figures frozen in time, their meaning suspended between patrol action and archival neglect. The images capture moments of motion, light, and shadow that refuse explanation, prompting speculation about activity, intent, or events left unrecorded. Even familiar landscapes, when framed without captions, take on an unfamiliar, almost spectral quality, as if the ice itself guards secrets the patrol dared not commit to paper. Each print is a fragment of narrative suspended, a dialogue between what was observed and what was left unspoken. Over decades, the uncatalogued images shaped Arctic research and reconnaissance planning, influencing patrol strategies while preserving questions that official reports never addressed. Analysts used the visuals to approximate routes, verify ice conditions, and study equipment placement, yet the absence of narrative required constant inference. Scholars and military strategists alike have noted that these silent images remind them how much remains unknowable about human activity in extreme environments, and how records, photographic or otherwise, can embody both clarity and ambiguity. The photographs thus serve as both reference and riddle, bridging operational purpose and unresolved mystery. Even as new files are declassified, the photographs remain enigmatic, offering glimpses of activity yet withholding their full story behind the silence of absent captions. They endure as frozen fragments of human endeavour, capturing the Arctic's stark landscapes and fleeting patrol movements while keeping the motives, observations and choices of those who pressed the shutter hidden from view. Every glance at these prints invites speculation, reconstruction and uncertainty, as the images themselves resist completion by words or interpretation. Caught between shutter and archive, the images endure, silent witnesses to moments the files refuse to explain. The patrol route that was quietly removed from maps. Successive updates to Arctic charts reveal a missing corridor, a patrol route that once appeared on every map yet vanished without comment. Cartographers' notes indicate the line was carefully drawn, verified against ice formations and previous expeditions, yet by a later series of updates it was absent, leaving blank white space where tracked movements had once guided patrols. Analysts reviewing declassified mapping records have found no explanation for its erasure, and the disappearance seems to have been deliberate, with both Cold War military and scientific maps altered in parallel, erasing institutional memory of a corridor that had once been considered routine. The route had been established for routine reconnaissance, designed to track ice drift, monitor temporary field stations, and ensure supply lines for distant patrol posts. Historical records describe patrols using sleds, small craft, and aerial reconnaissance to follow its length, verifying positions, noting hazards, and recording meteorological observations. The corridor connected known points of Arctic activity, providing both operational guidance and a means of triangulating measurements for longer-term environmental studies. While the route itself was utilitarian, its consistency over years of mapping made its sudden removal all the more perplexing, prompting questions about secrecy policy or previously unrecorded events. Along its course, jagged ridges, shifting ice flows, and treacherous snow bridges challenged even the most experienced teams, requiring careful navigation and constant recalibration. Patrol logs describe near misses with pressure ridges and areas where ice drifted unpredictably, forcing detours and adjustments to estimated travel times. Survey markers occasionally disappeared between inspections, replaced by temporary stakes or improvised beacons. Even in declassified aerial photographs, the corridor's path is visible only through subtle traces in snow and ice, emphasizing the precariousness of human activity in an environment that is both vast and unforgiving. Cartographic records show the route disappearing from official charts over a series of updates, leaving blank spaces where detailed lines once traced the patrol's path. Some maps retained partial segments, while others omitted the corridor entirely, as if it had never existed. Archivists note that revisions were made concurrently in multiple offices, suggesting coordination rather than error. Marginal notes reference reclassification or restricted use in cryptic shorthand, yet no files clarify why the patrol's corridor, once openly documented, had been removed from view. The absence of this corridor complicated subsequent missions, forcing officers to rely on incomplete records, improvised navigation, and cautious extrapolation from neighbouring mapped routes. Patrols continued to traverse the region, following their best understanding of ice conditions and landmarks, but without official recognition of the corridor, operational risk increased. Logs reference reliance on memory, sketches, and improvised compass bearings, all attempts to reconcile lived experience with the absence of formal maps, underscoring the subtle tension between knowledge retained in practice and knowledge recorded on paper. Recovered files reveal redacted notes and missing references to the route, while surviving documents hint at decisions to suppress or alter geographic information for undisclosed reasons. Handwritten annotations on older maps are partially obliterated, while typed instructions refer vaguely to sensitive operations or restricted zones, suggesting that either the patrol's findings or the corridor itself became classified. Even with access to previously secret files, analysts cannot determine whether erasure was driven by operational security, technological testing, or encounters with phenomena that were never meant to be disclosed. Analysts speculate that strategic considerations, including Cold War secrecy and the potential presence of sensitive installations, may have motivated the deliberate erasure. The Arctic had long been a theatre for clandestine monitoring, remote testing, and intelligence operations, making even seemingly mundane routes potentially significant. Maps and patrols were often treated as instruments of secrecy, altered to obscure the true extent of activity. The removal of the corridor, while unusual, fits within a broader pattern of Cold War cartographic manipulation, where presence and absence alike carried operational meaning. Remaining patrol logs and field photographs suggest continued use of the corridor, despite its absence on maps, indicating a disconnect between official records and operational reality. Photographs show sled teams navigating areas that correspond to the erased route, and journal entries reference landmarks consistent with prior mapping. Even when maps no longer acknowledged the corridor, human experience maintained its utility, revealing a parallel archive of memory and practice that persisted in contrast to official erasure. This duality between lived reality and documented absence forms the core of the corridor's enduring mystery. Efforts to reconcile physical evidence with cartographic omissions reveal contradictions that perplex both historians and military analysts, leaving the corridor's fate unresolved. Attempts to overlay photographs, patrol logs, and ice surveys against contemporary maps produce gaps and inconsistencies, highlighting the deliberate nature of the route's removal. Every comparison raises more questions. Why was the corridor deemed sensitive, and what information did its inclusion reveal that later reviewers wanted obscured? These contradictions create a space for speculation while underscoring the limits of historical reconstruction. Over time, the removal of the route shaped Arctic reconnaissance planning, influencing the way patrols navigated, recorded observations, and maintained institutional memory of their operations. Training manuals and subsequent patrol maps began emphasizing redundancy, additional verification methods, and contingency for erased or classified corridors. The absence of the official line became a lesson in risk management, demonstrating how the interplay of geography, secrecy, and human adaptation could alter both perception and practice. The corridor's erasure, therefore, had lasting consequences far beyond a single patrol or map revision. Even today, researchers encounter empty stretches on maps that once guided human movement, prompting questions about what was deemed too sensitive to preserve in print. Modern satellite imagery can trace ice formations and drift patterns along the same corridor, yet official documentation remains blank, preserving the intentional silence of past authorities. Historians and analysts alike continue to speculate about what prompted the corridor's removal, whether technological testing, intelligence activity, or an anomaly too sensitive to explain. The erased patrol route remains a ghost of Arctic history, inscribed in absence rather than presence. Where the maps fall silent, the vanished patrol corridor endures only in fragments, a hidden trace the ice refuses to forgive. The final transmission from Ice Station Delta. In the middle of the Arctic expanse, Ice Station Delta sent a message that would become its last, a transmission preserved in declassified logs yet never fully explained. The station's radio operators were recording routine readings when the signal originated, capturing both environmental data and cryptic references to an approaching presence that would be echoed across subsequent files. Archival notes indicate that the broadcast was logged in real time, yet the content's full meaning remained unresolved, with no patrol, aircraft, or remote monitoring post reporting any corroborating observation. The final transmission stands as a frozen fragment of communication, suspended between operational record and mystery. The station, a cluster of insulated modules anchored to drifting sea ice, had monitored weather, ice movement, and patrol communications for months before the final broadcast. Personnel were trained to log environmental readings and maintain equipment under extreme conditions, recording temperature, wind velocity, and ice displacement with meticulous care. Ice Station Delta functioned both as a research outpost and as a node in Cold War Arctic surveillance networks, tracking not only natural phenomena but the movement of nearby patrols and military exercises. Its location, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest established base, rendered the station both isolated and strategically valuable. Operators transmitted using high-frequency radio equipment designed to reach distant command posts, yet even under normal conditions, signal strength fluctuated with atmospheric and geomagnetic conditions. Logs document the station's reliance on repeated transmissions, message confirmation codes, and directional antennas to maintain contact. Engineers noted that auroral activity, sub-zero humidity, and ice accumulation on aerials could weaken signals or create unexpected echoes. In the final broadcast, technical annotations record anomalies in reception and transmission timing, suggesting environmental interference, or, more puzzlingly, an undetermined influence on the propagation of the signal itself. Blizzards and sub-zero temperatures had battered the station in the days leading up to the message, creating mechanical strain on equipment and limiting visibility of surrounding ice features. Field reports describe walls of drifting snow reducing sightlines to less than a dozen meters, while wind gusts caused temporary misalignment of observation instruments. Personnel records indicate increased maintenance demands on generators, radio transmitters, and insulation, all of which were documented meticulously in logs that survive to this day. These environmental pressures created conditions in which minor irregularities in signal behavior could easily go unexplained, or be mistaken for technical faults. The final recording references an unidentified presence approaching the station, a notation that appears in the logs without clarification or follow-up explanation. The entry is brief, listing coordinates and a cryptic remark about movement beyond sensor range, yet no further details were provided. The station's personnel, accustomed to tracking ice drift and wildlife, would have been well-trained observers, making the ambiguity particularly striking. Subsequent logs show attempts to re-establish normal monitoring, but no additional sightings or descriptions appear, leaving the approach of this presence documented only in the single, unresolved transmission. Command units attempted to respond, triangulating the signal and alerting nearby patrols, but the drift of the ice and atmospheric interference made tracking nearly impossible. Official communications from adjacent bases describe multiple attempts to verify the coordinates, with repeated failures to receive a clear return signal. Aircraft and sled patrols were dispatched in search patterns consistent with the transmission, yet environmental hazards and incomplete maps compounded operational difficulty. The combination of shifting ice, sub-zero temperatures, and technological limitations rendered the station effectively unreachable, a fact noted in the declassified correspondence preserved in military archives. Declassified files contain the transmission, technical logs, and redacted analyst notes, preserving the event while withholding interpretation of the anomalous message. Analysts' comments were often limited to unable to verify, or source unknown, suggesting either uncertainty or deliberate withholding of conclusions. Redactions obscure discussion of personnel reactions, specific timing, and interpretations that may have involved intelligence-sensitive observations. The logs themselves remain an artifact of protocol, capturing the last known human communications from Ice Station Delta, while leaving crucial elements deliberately, or inexplicably, unspecified. Signal patterns recorded before and after the broadcast show irregular frequencies, unexpected echoes, and unexplained drops in power, leaving engineers puzzled by their origin. Technical assessments documented transient fluctuations, frequency hopping, and intermittent disruptions that do not correlate with known equipment behavior or environmental conditions. Radio engineers highlighted that such anomalies could result from solar activity, ice interference, or atmospheric distortion, yet no conclusive explanation was ever offered. The irregularities remain preserved in archived waveform data, standing as a testament to signals that carried meaning only partially understood, and perhaps intentionally so. Personnel diaries hint at tension and apprehension, with cryptic remarks about movement beyond the ice and sounds on empty channels. Yet these entries were never officially filed. Written in shorthand, the notes suggest an awareness of phenomena beyond the normal scope of Arctic patrols, capturing a mixture of routine observation and unverified encounters. The human element, embedded within the structured logs of equipment and environmental readings, hints at unease or anticipation, giving the final transmission a weight that purely technical records cannot convey. These personal traces amplify the sense of isolation and uncertainty that define Ice Station Delta's final hours. The transmission influenced later Arctic station design and communication protocols, emphasizing redundancy, isolation procedures, and contingency plans for unexpected phenomena. Engineers and military planners studied the events at Delta to improve signal reliability and maintain operational safety during extended deployments. Protocols were updated to include multiple verification layers, alternate relay stations, and continuous monitoring of both environmental and technological factors. The lessons, extracted from an unexplained and incomplete message, shaped Arctic operations for decades, ensuring that no other station would drift entirely beyond observation or archival record. Even decades later, the final message from Ice Station Delta remains a point of fascination, the approaching presence never identified, the ice swallowing every answer. The transmission is frequently cited in studies of Arctic anomaly cases, and its waveform data continues to be revisited by analysts attempting to reconcile signal behavior with environmental conditions and human observation. Despite every technological advancement, the nature of what approached remains unresolved, its existence preserved only in the frozen archive of a radio log, a single haunting broadcast that defies explanation. The signal endures in the archives, a frozen trace of something unseen, leaving only the silence that followed to testify.